Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on History Valley Podcast. And today I am joined by Dr. Joshua Little, and today we'll be talking about the origins of the Hadith. And Joshua Little is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Department of Jewish, Christian, and Islamic Origins at the University of Groningen. He completed a bachelor's and bachelor's honors in history at Monash University in Australia. Before completing an MPhil in Islamic Studies, a Master's of Philosophy in Islamic Studies and History, and a Doctor of Philosophy in Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Oxford, his research focuses on the origins, transmission, and regionality of Hadith, Proto-Sunni Hadith criticism, the methods and debates of modern Hadith studies, the collection and canonization of the Quran, and the development of early Quranic exegesis. So welcome to the History Valley Podcast, Dr. Joshua Little.
Thank you, Jacob. It's great to be here. I've seen some of your previous interviews with other scholars, and so, I'm glad to be on.
Well, thank you. Thank you for joining me. So let's start obviously from the beginning and tell the audience what the Hadith is.
Yes. So this is actually covered in my presentation, but just to give a quick if you want me to just quickly say before we actually jump into it,
right.
Hadith are essentially like early Islamic traditions, early Islamic reports, right? And so they exist in like a vast corpus, and you can go into a room and have shelves full of volumes. It's actually a very easy way, if you know Judaism or rabbinical Judaism, Hadith are the oral Torah of Islam. This is the easiest way to understand. Unfortunately, when people ask me what I study, most people have no idea what the oral Torah is either. So I would be appealing to something they don't know to explain something else they don't know. But if you know the oral Torah, that's a very easy way to understand what's going on with Hadith. A less perfect analogy would be maybe like Christian church father writings, but it's not a very good analogy. But it's not the Quran, but it's a body of extra material around the Quran, if that makes sense, which is often a source of history and doctrine.
Would it be like sort of like a Talmud, but
yes.
for Islamic, very Islamic scenario?
Precisely.
Okay.
Yeah. In fact, just as in the Talmud, you have like rabbi from rabbi from rabbi. You have the same thing going on with Hadith, where it's from a source. When I get into my slides, all of that will be there. So I'll show you actual examples, and it'll become quite clear.
Okay, I'm going to add the slides to the stage, and there we go. Take us into it.
All right. But before I begin, a couple of preliminary notes. One is that I will upload onto my blog, IslamicOrigins.com, a bibliography. And then when you upload this video, I'll embed the video and then have below it all the sources. So that if anyone wants to follow up on anything, you can I'll have them in like headings, almost like slide for slide. I'll have all the sources, sort of primary sources, secondary sources, all the sort of sources that are sort of relevant to this. So if anyone wants to follow up on any of this, I'll make that available as soon as possible. So that's one preliminary note. And
I'll have the link to the blog in the description below, so anyone listening to this can click into that and find his blog.
Yeah. The second thing is there are a lot of slides, but we'll be cracking through them pretty quickly. It's just that there's going to be a lot of names and places that I need people to understand. See what I'm saying? So I apologize for there being a lot of slides, but it's mostly just lists and maps and things like that. So we'll get through them pretty quickly. The other thing is that you may notice that part one is traditional narratives, right? So what I'm going to try and give are the traditional understandings of the origins of Hadith, right? The traditional Islamic understandings of the origins of Hadith, the traditional narratives. And I know that this podcast is, I think, more oriented towards sort of like critical scholarship, right? The reason why I'm starting with all the traditional narratives before getting to the critical scholarship is that the critical scholarship's perspectives will not mean anything if you don't know the point of comparison, or the significance won't really be appreciated if you don't know to what degree it is agreeing or disagreeing with the traditional narratives. You see what I'm saying? and so it's worth first sort of touching up on that. And this is the case not just for, I'm sure, many of the sort of non-Muslims who are watching, also even many of the Muslims are actually will not be familiar with a lot of even the traditional narratives, or certainly the traditional narratives of rival sects. I'm going to be trying to cover like multiple perspectives on this. And even in their own traditional narrative, there may be things that they're aware of but haven't appreciated the significance of, right? And so maybe I can sort of bring that to light. So hopefully there'll be something of benefit for everyone, if that makes sense. But either way, before we get into sort of the critical scholarship and the sort of alternative, sort of recent, sort of modern perspectives on the origins of Hadith, we first have to cover the traditional perspective. So hopefully that makes sense. To put it another way, like if I wanted to talk about early Christianity, right, that there's more likely to be a kind of shared general background knowledge of, Palestine, the Sea of Galilee, the Sanhedrin, or the Roman Empire. You sort of know a lot of the geography and the kinds of actors involved. You need to know all that for this as well, right? And so that's why I'm going to begin with that. So hopefully this is all working. Okay, let me see if I can hide that. Okay, so quick table of contents. I'm going to give a quick recap of early Islamic history, just a quick crash course to sort of the major sort of dynasties and timeline in the early period. Then I'll cover sort of basic Hadith concepts, what is a Hadith and so on. And then I'll go into the traditional narratives of their origins. So let's jump right into it. So to begin with, we need a map. These are the major regions and also some of the major sub-regions of that we're going to be dealing with, right, of the sort of time period. Obviously, we have Arabia, right? And within Arabia, particularly important is the Hijaz, which is this sort of coastal, sort of western region in Arabia. We also have Iraq, which is the south of modern-day Iraq. We have Syria, and this isn't the modern country of Syria. This is like Greater Syria, right? The historic region of Syria, often also called Syria-Palestine. So it extends all the way down here. We also have Egypt and Persia, this sort of whole region around here. And in particular, Khurasan. Now, this is normally part of the Persian Empire, but it's a very important region. So I've sort of kept it in its own right. And then we also have Transoxiana or Transoxania, which is kind of like modern day Uzbekistan, right? So these are the sort of the key, this is sort of the key geography you want to try and keep in mind as we proceed. And to get a little bit more specific, these are the key centers. Now there are other regions and there are other centers that will be important for this or that, but for our purposes, I think these are probably the most important centers, right? And so I've tried to color them to sort of pick out the different regions, right? So the red here is Hijaz, where we have Medina and Mecca. The blue is Iraq, where we have Basra, Kufa, and Baghdad. Orange down here is Sana'a, which is Yemen. Fustat is sort of like modern Cairo. Fustat is the original city, and then at some point, I think someone builds the city of Cairo next door, sort of a new city, and then they end up merging together and become Cairo. So you can sort of think of Fustat as ancient Cairo. We also have Hims, Damascus, and Jerusalem. These are the major Syrian centers. And then over here in Persia, we have Rey, which is close to Tehran. And we also have Isfahan. And then over here beyond, we have in Khorasan, we have Marv or Merv, Nishapur, also Nesabur, Herat, and also Belch. And then over in Transoxania, we have Bukhara and Samarkand. So these are, I know it's a lot of names, there's a lot of places, but hopefully this helps to sort of situate us in terms of the key, geography. And now, some of these cities arise later than others. Kufa and Basra are there decades before finally Baghdad gets founded, for example. So just, maybe like a century or something. So just keep in mind that this isn't necessarily all simultaneous, but these are sort of trying to keep these in mind as sort of the key centers. Okay, now we have to talk about some tribes and dynasties, because before I can give you a summary of early Islamic history, you first have to know a lot of the key actors involved, right? Sort of the key sort of dynastic and familial or tribal sort of factions. So to begin with, we have the Quraysh, right? Oh, just to quickly remind, the Prophet comes from Mecca, he moves to Medina. This is where the life of the Prophet is occurring. And so the Quraysh are the tribe that the Prophet belongs to, who are dominant in Mecca, right? So the Quraysh are based in Mecca, And before the rise of Islam, they seem to be primarily engaged in leather trading up to Syria, right? Probably mostly selling leather to the Roman Empire. And so the Quraysh comprise many different, they're sort of a broad tribe, and they comprise many different sort of sub-tribes, right? Including the Umayyads, right? The Banu Umayyah, and they contain the Sufyanids. These are the descendants of, or the family of Abu Sufyan, and also the descendants of Marwan, the Marwanids, right? And then there are other branches as well. We also have the Hashemids, the Banu Hashim. This is the family of the Prophet, right? Or the more immediate family of the Prophet. He falls within this. And we also have the Abbasids. These are the descendants of Abbas, the Prophet's uncle. And also the Talibids. These are the descendants of Abu Talib. This is the Prophet's other uncle. And his most important son is Ali. And so his descendants we can call the Alids. And they include the Hassanids, the descendants of his son Hassan, and the Husseinids, the sons of his son Hussein. So this is just a quick overview of some of the key actors. Now let's jump to a quick chronology. By the way, Jacob, at any point, feel free to jump in with a question if anything is unclear. Obviously, at the end, we can go into more questions and queries. But if there's, as we're going along, if you need anything clarified, let me know, all right?
Will do.
All right. So let's do a quick chronology. So to begin with, obviously, we have Muhammad. He has his prophetical career. He dies in 632. And I'll just quickly jump ahead. This is the territory that he controls by the end of his life, right? He sort of either conquered or entered into treaties with this region of Arabia. After his death, the polity temporarily falls apart in the wars of apostasy, the so-called wars of apostasy, the Hurub Ridda. And this is basically Makkah and Medina are one faction led by a guy named Abu Bakr, right? One of the Prophet's friends. And then there are others who just leave the movement altogether. There are others who follow sort of new prophets, and there are others who just sort of refuse to pay taxes, right? But otherwise are reportedly just are still Muslims. They just don't want to pay taxes. They don't recognize Abu Bakr. And then there are others who are just other tribes who previously were not involved with anything, right? And so eventually the sort of Makkah Medina faction wins out and sort of conquers all of Arabia. And that's under Abu Bakr, right? And so that's this map here, right? 634. By that point, Abu Bakr has conquered all of Arabia. And so this period we could call the Qurashi Emirate, right? The reason why I'm saying emirate rather than caliphate is that in all the early inscriptions, the ruler is identified as the Amir al-Mu'mineen, the commander of the believers, right? Amir is like from that you get emirate. You see what I'm saying? Whereas the term Khalifatullah, like caliph, shows up later in the archaeological records. So I'm going to say emirate rather than caliphate. And the reason why I'm calling it this, right? Because if you're not familiar with the history, then there's nothing to be confused about. But if you're familiar with Islamic history, like if you're a student or a researcher, this is an unusual way of devising things, right? Having a Qurashi emirate with just Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman, right? These sort of successive rulers of the early sort of polity. Normally, people call this the era of al-Khulafa Rashidun, right? The rightly guided caliphs. And so they would also include Ali here. The reason why I haven't done that is that this is like Heilsgeschichte. This is like salvation history. This is like a very specific Sunni religious narrative, that there are these four rightly guided caliphs who are all equally valid, although they think some of them are like Abu Bakr is the best, followed by Umar, followed by Uthman, followed by Ali. You often find that perspective, but they're all co-equally rightly guided, legitimate caliphs, and so on and so forth. I mean, this is like taking sides in a very specific theological debate, and in a way that doesn't make sense for us as sort of non-Sunni historians, right? Ali is a leader of a faction in a civil war that he loses. That there's just no way to justify by any sort of conventional system of periodization having him as the next ruler. It doesn't make any sense, right? It'd be like, I don't know, to use a sort of fictional narrative, it'd be like putting, I don't know, Robb Stark as the next king of Westeros after Robert Baratheon. He's a participant in a civil war that he loses. It doesn't make any sense, right? Spoilers for those books, I suppose. Anyway, you sort of see what I'm saying, right? So it doesn't really make any sense. Ali should not be included as you may like Ali, you may think he had the strongest claim. I'm not taking sides on the legitimacy debate. What I'm saying is, as historians, when we try and develop consistent systems for periodizing things, it just doesn't make sense to include Ali. So it's Abu Bakr, Omar, and Uthman. They form a coherent kind of succession of rule, and this is, I'm just going to call this the Qurashi Emirate, because the common denominator here is that they're all members of the Quraysh, right? They're all from various different sort of sub-tribes of the Quraysh. And again, this is the empire that they're ruling. So this is the Prophet, Abu Bakr, and then Omar, and right to sort of the death of Omar and the early reign of Uthman. Well, this one's actually to the death of Omar, 644. Then a civil war breaks out, right? Some discontent arises in Egypt and in Iraq, and these discontented parties travel to the Hijaz. They confront Uthman. Eventually, he's murdered. And so this is the outbreak of the first civil war, which is called Fitna. It's the first Fitna. And so this is a war where there's Ali, who's based in, he goes up and ends up being based in Iraq. There's Muawiyah, who's based in Syria. There's Abu Bakr's family, right? This is Aisha, Talha, and Az-Zubair. And they rebel or lead a faction in the Hijaz up against Ali, and they get defeated. There's sort of an Egyptian faction, and there's also the Khawarij, the Kharijites, who are sort of initially support Ali, but then when he sort of negotiates with Muawiyah, they think, well, he's gone off, the deep end. He's become impious, right? He's gone against God, and so they actually end up killing him. And Muawiyah wins. And so the next ruler and the next dynasty is the Umayyads. From this point onwards, Muawiyah, who is an Umayyad, he has taken over the empire, and then he's followed by his sons. This is, by the way, if you want to understand what's happening here, this is kind of like if the son of Judas Iscariot became the Pope of the early church, right? Like Muawiyah is the son of Abu Sufyan, who was like the Prophet's leading sort of antagonist in Makkah. So this is kind of an extraordinary development, right? And it was viewed as extraordinary at the time, right? Now, what's funny is that depending on your point of view, this could be a really good thing or a really bad thing. So you could say even the Prophet's former enemies have become the leaders of the empire, right? Positive spin. Or you could say the Prophet's worst enemies have taken over the empire. You could sort of see it from either way. Either way, it's pretty extraordinary. And so Muawiyah rules sort of uncontested for 2 decades, and then he dies, and he arranges for his son to follow him, and he was followed then by his son as well. However, a civil war breaks out after Muawiyah's death, and so this is the second fitna, and once again it's the Umayyads, who are based in Syria, fighting against the Hashemids, so Ali's children and their supporters. There's also a new faction, the Zubayrids, but it's actually just the continuation of Abu Bakr's family. It's led by Abdullah ibn Zubair, right? Who's the grandson of Abu Bakr. And then you have also the Kharijites arise as well. The Khawarij also take over a large part of Arabia, for example. And so this is sort of a map of the empire at the time of the outbreak of the first at the end of the first civil war, and this is approximately the empire also during the second civil war. The Umayyads win once again, and a new branch of the family takes over. It's the Marwanids, and we have this succession of caliphs from Marwan through Abdul Malik, Al-Walid, Sulaiman, Omar II, Yazid II, Hisham, Al-Walid the second, and then there's another civil war. And this time, it's a civil war within the Umayyads. It's Yazid III versus Marwan II. And this is approximately the empire at this time. Just when the civil war winds down and the Umayyads emerge victorious against the Umayyads, there's a huge revolution comes barreling out of the east, out of Khurasan, right? And it makes its way across through Persia, through Iraq, and through Syria. And this is the Hashemid Revolution. And they, destroy the Umayyad dynasty, and then the revolutionary leaders sort of get together in Iraq as the revolution is sort of coming to an end, and they install as the new caliph al-Safah, right? This is an Abbasid. So within the family of the Prophet, you have the Prophet is within the Banu Hashim, and within the Banu Hashim, you have the Abbasids. And so the Abbasids were able to gain control of the caliphate. After al-Safah dies, there's a short civil war. His, I think it's his brother versus his nephew, I think. The El-Mansur wins out. It's an uncle versus a nephew. Abdullah is the uncle, El-Mansur is the nephew. The nephew wins. And so El-Mansur takes over. And then under him, there's another rebellion. This is the rebellion of An-Nafs Az-Zakiyah. And this is actually a Talibid rebellion. Now the Banu Hashim is splitting apart, and the descendants of Ali are saying, well, actually, we should be the ones who are ruling, not the descendants of, Abbas. And so they get crushed, and then the Abbasids continue to rule. There's another civil war between the Abbasids. Now it's Al-Amin versus Al-Ma'mun. Al-Ma'mun wins. There's also another, the Abbasids then continue to rule. A notable episode here is the Rationalist Inquisition. The Al-Ma'mun, towards the end of his reign, he institutes an inquisition against leading scholars who say that the Quran is uncreated. And the rationalists say, no, it's created. It hasn't existed since eternity past with God. It was created by God at some point. And so they're violently imposing that view on the rival view. Eventually, in 861, there's a coup. The sort of increasingly the Abbasids are bringing in elite slave soldiers from Central Asia. So these mostly Turkish slave soldiers, as to be their sort of army to shore up their power, which is sort of obviously shaken by these sort of successive civil wars within the Abbasids. And so eventually the Mamluks murder the caliph and sort of take effective power. And from this point onwards, the Abbasid Empire is disintegrating. So this, you can see here, we have the Abbasids in Iraq, but all these various sort of local tendencies and dynasties and forces are increasingly taking over, and are, initially they're sort of semi-autonomous and they still recognize the Abbasids. But as time goes on and more dynasties appear, you begin to have dynasties that no longer recognize the Abbasids, and the empire fractures and falls apart. And so out of all of this, we get a couple of surviving Islamic sects, right? The majority sect is the Sunni sect. These are the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. So these are the people of normative practice and community. Community here, I think, has sort of the sense of the majority. It's the community as a whole, right? So this is sort of a majoritarian kind of tendency, if that makes sense. And there are now, Sunni theologians would point to various specific issues to sort of, what defines someone being a Sunni. But if you look at it sort of historically, and you just look at sort of the general tendency, what's sort of a common denominator here, two sort of key issues that really stand out, right, that seem to be at the center of Sunnism, are the view that all four caliphs are legitimate, right? So initially, most people either say Uthman is like, most people initially accept Abu Bakr and Omar. And then when Uthman is murdered, there's a big split. Like, do you side with Uthman or do you side with Ali, right? And most people will either side with Ali and reject Uthman, or they side with Uthman and they reject Ali. But eventually this view emerges that sort of is like a synthesis, which is, okay, we accept both, right? And so this is the Sunni, this is like at the heart of Sunnism, is that you accept all four of the early caliphs, Abu Bakr, Omar, Uthman, and Ali, all of them together. Another sort of idea at the core of Sunnism is the idea that the companions as a whole were collectively good, right? They did fight against each other, they had civil wars and so on, yes, but they're all fundamentally good, they're all fundamentally, truthful, reliable, etc. And this becomes the global majority. And there are four Sunnism now approximately, you could say, comprises sort of 4 legal schools and 3 theological schools. There are also various Sufi mystical tendencies as well. And there are some people who sort of fall outside the 4 legal schools as well. It's a little complicated, but the overwhelming majority of Muslims are nominally members of these 4 legal schools and 3 theological schools: the Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanbali legal schools, and the Maturidi, Ash'ari, and Athari theological schools. We also have several Shi'i sects. They are the Shi'at Ali, right? The party of Ali. And at the core of these sort of various different Shi'i tendencies, the common sort of denominator is this sort of veneration for Ali and his descendants, and the idea that these should be the legitimate rulers. And the Shia today, various kinds, are the majority in Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Bahrain, Azerbaijan, and there are 12 Shia in Iran. There are Zaydis in Yemen, for example, Ismailis, who are sort of scattered around the world. There are Alawis in Syria, and so on. There's also another sect, which is the most overlooked one. This is the sort of sect that most people don't know about, and this is the Ibadi sect, right? These are the followers of Ibn Ibad, right? They're the El-Ibadiyya. And their view is that the most pious and learned person should be the ruler, regardless of whether they're Qurashi or, Hashemite or whatever. And they view both Uthman and Ali as illegitimate. Their view is, so whereas the Sunnis go to the view of, they're both legitimate, the Ibadis go to the view, they're both illegitimate. They think both of them started off good and then went bad, right? And there are notable Ibadi minorities in Oman, which is sort of a nominally Omani country, and also across North Africa and in Zanzibar. Okay, so early Islamic history. Hopefully now we've got a general picture of the people and the places and so on, and we can move on to basic Hadith concepts. Before I move on, though, do you have any questions, Jacob?
Not so far.
Okay. Let's continue. So let's start with some basic Hadith concepts. What is a Hadith? A Hadith is just a report, right? The plural is a Hadith, although Hadith is also used as sort of a collective noun. And there are synonyms for Hadith, Khabar, Athar. They sort of mean the same thing. Originally, they are just synonyms. Later on, like centuries and centuries later, people will they tend to use Hadith for something from the Prophet, and then Athar for something from a companion of the Prophet, and then, Khabar for other later things. But this is a later distinction. If you look in the earliest period, like the earliest Hadith scholarship, they're using these terms interchangeably. In terms of structure, there are 2 key components of a Hadith. There's the Isnad, which is the chain of transmitters, and then there's the Matan, which is the actual text or content. And here's an example, right? So this is recorded in a Hadith collection, the Kitab as-Sunan of Ibn Majah. And so he records this. Muhammad ibn Bashar related to us. Ubaidullah ibn Abdul Majid related to us. Abdurrahman ibn Abi Zinad related to us. From his father, from Abu Salama, from Abu Huraira, who said, the Messenger of God said, physical contact with cats does not invalidate a prayer because they are counted as regular household objects, right? So this is just a random hadith. I just picked this one up at random. And you can see here the part in red is the Isnad, right? Muhammad from Ubaidullah, from Abdurrahman, from his father, from Abu Salama, from Abu Huraira, from the Prophet. That's the Isnad. That's the chain of transmission. And then the actual statement from the Prophet, this is the actual content, the matan, right? You can also see here, this is another way of thinking about hadith. It's sort of like a Russian doll of quotations, right? It's like a concentric quotations. There's kind of a ring structure here. It's a quote within a quote within a quote, right? So in the red, this is Ibn Majah speaking. Ibn Majah is saying Muhammad ibn Bashar related to us. And then he's quoting Muhammad ibn Bashar, and he's the one saying Ubaidullah related to us. And then the next part in green, now we're quoting Ubaidullah, right? Abdurrahman related to us. And at this point, it's all Ubaidullah speaking from his father, from Abu Salama, from Abu Huraira, and finally, we have Abu Huraira's voice, the Messenger of God said, and then we have the Prophet's voice, Muhammad's voice, right? So you can sort of see how putatively it's a quote within a quote within a quote, right? So there are various types of hadith, right? We can sort of define hadith by genre or by ascription type, right? In terms of genre, there are doctrinal hadiths, which includes legal and also sort of theological or dogmatic hadiths. There are pious or edifying hadiths, hadiths that are about sort of instilling sort of good character and piety and things like that. There are exegetical hadiths. These are explaining the meaning and context of the Quran. There are biographical hadith, right, meaning hadith about the life and times of the Prophet. And there are also just more general sort of historical hadith that often just get the term akhbar, right, or khabar, right, plural akhbar, rather than hadith, but they're also, I mean, they're a type of hadith as well. In terms of ascription, there are hadiths that are attributed all the way back to or they're about the Prophet. There are hadiths of companions, hadiths of followers, hadiths of the sort of alid imams, right? The Shi'a refer to the key alid figures who they regard as having been the sort of, you know, the rightful rulers. They refer to them as imams, right? The meaning is sort of similar to caliph. Originally, caliph and imam basically have the same meaning, and so the Shia tend to retain the word imam for this kind of role. And so the Alid imams are also, you know, that's another type of hadiths from the imams. And then also the Ibadis have their versions as well from their early leaders also. Now, when people think of hadith now, though, what they are mostly thinking of is doctrinal ascriptions to the Prophet, right? This is like the foremost thing, the first thing people think of when they think of hadith. But there are these other kinds of hadith as well. And there are many kinds of hadith collections. Hadith are preserved in these large compilations, you know, and some of them are just general collections of all kinds of different topics that are arranged by topic, right? These usually have the title Musannaf. There are Sunan collections. These tend to be legal collections, and they're arranged by topic. There are Musnad collections. They're normally arranged by the companion transmitter, right? So, for example, if I go back here, this one would be arranged in a chapter of transmissions from Abu Huraira, right? He's the companion transmitter here. There's also Maghazi or Sirah works. These are basically collections of biographical hadith, but they're arranged chronologically, and they also usually include other things as well, like poetry, lists of people in battles, and things like that. We also have tafsir, right? These are sort of exegetical collections that are normally arranged by a Quranic verse, right? So you go verse by verse, and then you sort of list relevant, you know, exegetical reports. Although tafsir is also used for other kinds of commentaries as well, where it's just explaining the language and not citing reports. We also have ta'arikh works. These are sort of general historical collections that are usually arranged by chronology. Again, though, there are other kinds of, especially early ta'arikh works that don't actually cite reports. They're just chronologies of key events. And there are many other kinds as well. There are many, many different kinds of hadith, you know, collections. These are just some of the main ones. And the corpus is gigantic, right? This is just a very incomplete list of authors of hadith works, right? I mean, it's just many of these authors author multiple works, and each of them is usually citing like thousands of hadiths, right? So it's just a staggering corpus. And again, this is, you know, just a selection, right? Some of these, by the way, are not directly extant, but are extant via student redaction. So like Al-Humaydi, for example, over here, what we have is the redaction of his student, but, you know, so just keep that in mind that some of these are via extant redactions. Others, we just have the scribal copies of their own compositions. But the numerousness is deceptive. A lot of hadiths are duplicates, right? So this is the hadith I gave as the example before about the cat not invalidating prayer, which is actually this one here from Ibn Majah. But there are many other co-transmissions of the same hadith, right? Going back to sort of earlier sort of common sources, right? And then over here we have more as well, going back and putatively even going all the way back to Abu Huraira himself. The question of whether we can trust isnads and how far back, and whether we can trust these sort of common links, is another big debate. And I don't want to go into that now, maybe another time, right? I'm going to sidestep some of those more sort of specific methodological debates and like source critical methods and things like that, perhaps another time, right? So, but the point I want to emphasize here is just that there are many, many sort of iterations or parallels of the same text over and over and over, right? And there are sort of depending on the text, there are sort of minor differences, sometimes major differences, sometimes staggering differences between texts. Here, they're broadly similar. And so here's some statements about this, right? So Ahmad ibn Hanbal is a sort of a famous early hadith scholar, and he reportedly said, "We used to write down hadith from 6 or 7 paths of transmission without our grasping it. So how can someone who writes down from only a single path of transmission grasp it?" Right? Now he's making a point here about how you want to collect different versions of hadiths, to understand its sort of, how to interpret it, or it's maybe something about its provenance or something like. The hadith critics often will collect multiple versions of hadiths, and if there are discrepancies, then they'll try and resolve those. But if you only had one version, you might miss a discrepancy, you see. Although he may also just be talking about understanding or interpreting the hadith. Like maybe one hadith adds key details or contextual information absent in another version, so you'd miss that if you only looked at one version, for example. Anyway, either way, the point is that they're collecting a lot of duplicates. You see what I'm saying? Like different sort of co-transmissions of the same hadith. Right. And there's also a quote from Abu Zur'a. He's a student of Ahmad, and he's talking to Ahmad's son, Abdullah. And he says, "Your father memorized 1,000,000 hadiths." Now, a later scholar, Al-Dhahabi, he comments on this, and he says, "This is a sound report concerning the extent of Abu Abdullah," that's Ahmad ibn Hanbal's, "knowledge. However, they included in their counting thereof repetitions, companion reports, the legal opinions of the followers, what was explained by later figures, and other things like that. By contrast, texts that are solidly attributed to the Prophet do not exceed 10,000 of the total count." Right. So what he's saying is that this is still a huge corpus, right? But there are a lot of duplicates as well involved, right? That's sort of the key thing I want to emphasize here. But there are still, by Al-Dhahabi's estimation, there are 10,000 basic, authentic prophetical texts, right? So that's still quite a large number. So just to quickly summarize, hadith are religio-historical reports attributed to early Muslim authorities on numerous topics, usually with a text or a metin, usually with a chain of transmission, and isnad recorded in extant collections, right? And hadith are the most voluminous, detailed, and comprehensive set of sources on early Islamic history. So it's very, they're a very important source that we have to try and use. If you take away hadith, you're left with almost nothing, right? Like, you still have something. There are other sources that can be used, but hadith are just so gigantic. If we can use hadith, that would be certainly to our advantage, right? It's hard to sort of set aside hadith if you want to try and reconstruct early Islamic history. Okay, do you have any questions before we continue?
Does the hadith like embellish narratives that are in the Quran? Does it like add or try to expand or maybe even fill in gaps?
Yes. The exegetical hadith are all doing that, right? This is very common. But they add all kinds of. We'll come back to this, right? We'll come back to this. But this is definitely one of the things that hadith do. The Quran is often very vague. It'll refer to things in only a fragmentary way. And so often exegetical hadiths will try and elaborate, fill in the gaps. What was this thing? What was this allusion to? Who are these people? What was the circumstances? Or even with biblical narratives, when the Quran will briefly refer to a biblical narrative, you'll then have more expanded, related biblical narratives that are sort of building on this and filling in the gaps and so on in exegetical hadith. So absolutely. Do you have any other questions?
Not so far.
Okay. Oh, wait. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Oh, you can. Okay. I'm never sure. Does the light mean it's on or off? Anyway. Okay. So let's continue. So now let's turn to traditional narratives of the origins and development of hadith, right? And so there's several narratives I want to cover, right? There are Sunni narratives, there are Shi'i narratives, there are Ibadi narratives, and there are also rationalist perspectives. And I say narratives in the plural, even for the specific sects or subsects, because there isn't a single coherent narrative, right? What you have is various different reports that you can sort of combine together, but there are always little discrepancies. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's very hard. There isn't really a single traditional narrative that you have to construct. Even the traditional scholars are selecting this one, but some others will select a different one, or they put the emphasis in a different place. There isn't really a single traditional narrative, if that makes sense. So just keep that caveat in mind, that these are to some degree composite traditional narratives, if that makes sense. All right, so let's get into it. So let's begin with the Sunni narratives. So to begin with, we have the Prophet Muhammad. Obviously, he is a conduit for the Quran, which is the word of God. It's come through God via Gabriel. But he's also, not just with the Quran, he's also bringing Sunnah, right? When he speaks, when he acts, when he legislates, all of this is with God's authority, right? And on the traditional sort of Sunni interpretation, the Quran refers to this, right? It says that the Prophet has been sent not just with the book, the scripture, the Quran, and he's also been sent with hikmah, right? Wisdom, which is interpreted as being the Sunnah. He's come with his Sunnah, the Sunnah of the Prophet. And so Sunnah is just sort of the normative or exemplary practice, right? And this is identified with prophetical Hadith, right? Prophetical Hadith preserve the Sunnah of the Prophet, right? And so the Prophet himself oversaw the propagation of his Sunnah in an extremely sort of systematic and programmatic and comprehensive way. He taught all of his followers. He also dispatched missionaries and teachers to other areas around Arabia. He also ordered some of his rulings to be sort of written down. Or did he? I mean, there are other reports that say he forbade the writing down. So again, it's hard to tell a single. Do you see what I'm saying? Immediately we run into problems like which.
Right.
It's hard to tell a single traditional narrative, but I want to try and push out for now. I just want to try and give the traditional narrative as much as possible and push aside the critical issues. But it's going to be hard sometimes to avoid them because there are just these sort of direct contradictions about did he or did he not forbid writing down hadith. And just a reminder, this is Arabia, in his day. When he dies, this is what he controls. He's followed by the companions, right? The companions of the Prophet, the Sahaba, right? And so they are obsessed with the Prophet's Sunnah. I don't mean that in a negative sense. I just mean they are really, really, really keen to understand, to find, to follow, and to transmit the Sunnah of the Prophet, right? And so they reportedly transmit thousands of hadith. In effect, their act of transmitting is sort of what is bringing hadith into being, right? The Prophet says something or does something. When a companion then transmits that to someone, it is now a tradition. Do you see what I'm saying? It becomes a tradition. So these are anecdotes, precedents, saying, and so on of the Prophet. The Prophet's Sunnah are now turning into hadith through the statements of the companions to, the next generation. And some hadith are written down on sheets of parchment. There are reports of these sort of suhuf, right? These sort of pages of that some companions are writing down. Again, though, or they didn't do that, or it was also forbidden. So keep that in mind. At this time, most hadith are being transmitted orally, although there's some reports will say they were being transmitted paraphrastically, as long as this is ariwaya bil ma'na, right? As long as you, it's fine to paraphrase as long as you preserve the meaning accurately. Others say that it was ariwaya bil lafz. This is like verbatim transmission. And there are some of the companions transmit thousands of hadith, right? So some of the major companion transmitters are Aisha, right? This is the wife of the Prophet, right? Abu Huraira, he becomes a governor, temporary governor in Medina at some point after the Prophet's death under the Umayyads. We have Ibn Abbas, he's the cousin of the Prophet, and he also at one point becomes a governor. We have Abdullah ibn Umar, he's the son of the second ruler, Umar. We also have Anas ibn Malik. He was reportedly a servant of the Prophet. All of these figures are transmitting thousands of hadiths from the Prophet. And all of them are reliable, right? All of the companions, there's this like ta'adil as-sahaba or adalat as-sahaba. It's like the collective reliability, honesty, uprightness of the companions. They're all reliable, right? All the followers of the Prophet who met him are all honest people, right? But there are some reports of them already, some companions are double checking some things or criticizing some things and so on, right? And this is, again, under Abu Bakr and then under Omar. And then all the way to the beginning of Muawiyah's reign, right? So this is the world of the companions. They're followed by the followers, the tabi'un, right? And this is obviously, there's a massive expansion of the empire. There are many new sort of converts. The companions are also having children. And so these all become sort of the students of the companions. And by around 700, almost all companions are dead. One or two sort of linger on. Anas bin Malik, for example. Abu Tufail, another example. And at this point, we have the rise of fabrications, right? It's among the followers that fabrications proliferate. This generates a necessity for demanding sources. And so this is, when the sort of isnad really kicks in, as, among the followers. The companions often, the companions don't have to cite their sources, right? They, often it's understood or implied, just if you look at the statements, that the companions are not actually, many of the hadiths they transmit themselves, the eyewitness. They're just transmitting a statement or an assertion. And so the idea is, well, they're transmitting from other companions and they're just all reliable and it's fine. See what I'm saying? But once you get to the students of the companions, the followers, now checking for sources becomes a necessity, right? So you have the rise of fabrications, and there are all kinds of different motives for fabrications, right? Some of them are just for sectarian causes. Some of them are for edification, to try and give people good character. So they're sort of like, pious motivations, like pious fabrication. Sometimes it's just, people thought if something is good, then the Prophet ought to have said this. There's also like naked self-interest, right? People just trying to say the Prophet legitimized like this or that very specific thing that is conducive to their, like, for example, economic interests. Another one is just novelty. People just wanted to have sort of novel, interesting things. We also have entertainment as well. People are just making things up to entertain people. And so, again, to get around this, more and more people are engaging in hadith criticism. Another early figure among the followers who are engaging in hadith criticism, we have Sha'bi and Ibn Sirin. Hadith are also being written down at certain points. There are reports of, the second Omar II, right, the Umayyad Caliph. He orders for hadith to be written down. There's also Hammam ibn Munabbih. He reportedly writes down a sahifa, a sort of notebook of hadiths from his teacher, Abu Huraira. However, still the general impression is that the transmission of hadith remains primarily oral. And then sort of here's the empire at this time. It's sort of, you can see it's massively expanding. We then have the followers of the followers, the atba' at-tabi'in. And so there's a famous quote from a subsequent hadith scholar, Ali ibn al-Madini, where he says, I looked at hadith, or I looked at isnads, and lo, the isnad revolves around six. And these are the six, right? So these are sort of like the big six. We have Amr ibn Dinar in Mecca. We have Ibn Shihab az-Zuhri in Medina, although he moves to Syria. We have Qatada ibn Di'ama in Basra. We have Yahya ibn Abi Kathir in Basra, although he ends up moving to somewhere in Arabia. We have Abu Ishaq as-Sabi'i and Al-A'mash in Kufa. Some hadith criticism continues. So we're told that Ayub as-Sakhtiyani and Abdullah ibn Awn both continue to sort of criticize some hadiths and try and root out sort of the fabrications and so on. Hadith are increasingly being written down. We have reports of az-Zuhri's sort of vast corpus of notebooks, although there was also oral transmission as well. And again, this is what the empire looks like at the time. Finally, the Abbasid revolution occurs, and very soon after that, or almost immediately, we have this boom, a literary boom, right? So we have the first biographies of the Prophet being written. They all have the title Kitab al-Maghazi. And we have Musa ibn Uqba in Medina, Muhammad ibn Ishaq, who is Medinan, although he moves to Iraq. And we also have Ma'mar ibn Rashid, his Basran, and he goes up to northern Iraq, and then he goes down to Yemen. Again, though, there are just contradictions, right? There's an explicit report that Ibn Ishaq is the first to put together a biography, but then there are these other reports that actually it's already happening earlier with Urwa ibn Zubair in Medina, also Ban ibn Uthman as well. And so again, it's hard to tell. It's like a single coherent narrative. You sort of have to choose between competing narratives to some extent. And so we also have at this time the first systematic written collections of hadith, right? These usually have the title of Musannaf, right? Kitab al-Musannaf or Kitab al-Jami'. And in terms of genre, these are general collections. They contain doctrinal hadith, exegetical hadith, biographical hadith, and they're arranged by topic, right? In terms of ascription type, these are actually mostly the reports of the followers, and then to a lesser extent the companions, and then to a lesser extent the Prophet. And these are the works of Ibn Jurayj in Makkah, Al-Awza'i in Syria, Ma'mar in, goes from Basra to Yemen, Ibn Abi Aruba in Basra, Sufyan al-Thawri in Kufa, and Hamad ibn Salama in Basra. And these do not survive. We don't have these texts in their original versions. They survive in later recensions or in the later, mostly in later works. Oral transmission continues, but it's also oral now. People are like reading off notes or listening and writing down. Do you see what I'm saying? Increasingly, there's a written component in the oral transmission. We also have the rise of this institution of arihla fi talab al-ilm, right? This is traveling in search of knowledge. So people are increasingly traveling around to learn hadith, right? Some famous early examples are Ma'mar ibn Rashid, right? He starts in Basra. He then goes to Al Jazeera, which is kind of like northern Iraq and also eastern Syria. To put it bluntly, the area that ISIS took over is actually a kind of naturally occurring region, a historic region called Al Jazeera, right? And so that's where Ma'mar goes. Then he also travels to the Hijaz, and then he ends up in Yemen, right? Another famous early traveler is Ibn al-Mubarak, and he starts in the east in Marv or Merv in modern-day Turkmenistan, and then he travels all the way. He travels to Yemen, Iraq, Egypt, Al Jazeera, and Syria. And there's also Uthman ibn Atiq. He is an Egyptian. He travels to Iraq to learn hadith there. So increasingly people are starting to travel around to different regions to learn hadith. The earliest extant hadith collections are mostly non-prophetical. They're arranged by topic, and they're either general topics or legal topics. And so these are the works of Malik ibn Anas, which is not itself extant. We have all of these different sort of student redactions, and you can clearly see that they're all transmitting from Malik's corpus, right? You can actually reconstruct to a fair degree Malik's original based on the different sort of student recensions. At least I've found that. We also have works of Abu Yusuf. Malik is in Medina, just to clarify. Abu Yusuf and Ash-Shaybani in Kufa. We also have Abd al-Razaq in Yemen and Ibn Abi Shayba in Kufa. There's also we have also the Musnad of At-Tayalisi, who's Basran from around this time. However, what we have is the redaction of a student, and one scholar, Yoinbal, argues that this was originally a Musannaf, right? So it was originally mostly a collection of prophetic, follower and companion hadiths, and then it's been redacted. He's just taken out the prophetical ones, and so now it's a Musnad. So argues Yoinbal. And so this is the empire at the time, just to remind you. And we also have then around this time, right, in the late 700s, we have the rise of the people of hadith, the ashab al-hadith or the ahlul hadith. And so disagreements are proliferating, all kinds of doctrinal disagreements are proliferating around the empire. And so the people of hadith are people who are saying the solution is hadith. The solution is we should base everything on hadith, right? And if you don't have a hadith for it or a Quranic verse for it, then la adri. You say, I do not know, right? You do not take a stance. You don't infer things. You don't derive logical arguments. You aren't basing things on local custom. You aren't basing things on, these sort of abstract syllogistic argumentation, on opinion. None of that. They're saying you have to have a text, a direct, explicit text, either the Quran or a Hadith. And if you don't have that, whatever. And they also say, as long as the Hadith is sound, we accept it. Bila kayf. Even if we don't know how, we don't understand it exactly, like it seems maybe like theologically, maybe it seems like illogical in some way. Doesn't matter. Okay? We're basing everything on Hadith, right? And they have a hierarchy of Hadith. In particular, prophetical Hadith are at the top. You've got to base everything as much as possible on prophetical Hadith. Then, if you don't have prophetical Hadith, companion Hadith, and those trump the rest, follow Hadiths or whatever. And in the earliest list of the people of Hadith, which is recorded by Ibn Qutayba, we have all of these different figures listed, and these are, he has a huge list. This is not by any means an exhaustive list, but these are just some of the key figures in his list, right? Who I think people recognize, like Ma'mar, Ibn Abi Aruba, Shu'ba. So these are some major early, figures, and there are others as well, right? So it's this emerging faction who are trying to prioritize Hadith, right, as a way to, adjudicate on disputes and as a way to base doctrine. We then have the rise of Hadith criticism that sort of emerges seemingly a lot with the people of Hadith. Again, we've already seen that there is earlier Hadith criticism on the traditional narrative, but there's a definite sense in the sources that something changes with this Basran Hadith scholar, Shu'ba ibn al-Hajjaj, right? He says, nobody criticized Hadith the way that I criticized Hadith, right? So there's something changes, right? There's some sort of shift that happens with Shu'ba, and through Shu'ba to his students, Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Qattan and Abdurrahman ibn Mahdi, they're both Basrans, and from them to the key students after them are Yahya ibn Ma'in in Baghdad, Ali ibn al-Madini in Basra, and Ahmad ibn Hanbal in Baghdad. And from them, it passes to some of their, key students like al-Bukhari, right? You may recognize al-Bukhari. Actually, I won't jump to that yet, but al-Bukhari is the Sahih of al-Bukhari for Sunnis is the most authoritative Hadith collection. So you can see how al-Bukhari has come out of this almost a school of Hadith criticism that comes from Shu'ba. And so this method, the method of Shu'ba, which I'm going to call Hadith criticism proper, just to try and distinguish it from the other kinds of Hadith criticism, or maybe I should say proto-Sunni Hadith criticism proper, I don't know, whatever. I'm just talking about the method of Shu'ba. We could also call it canonical Hadith criticism. It's the Hadith criticism that produced the canon. Yeah, so it's the method of Shu'ba and his students. And so what's their approach? They do have, this is often overlooked, they do have a content sort of criterion, right? If a Hadith has overtly unorthodox content, they'll just dismiss it out of hand, right? But otherwise, what they're mainly doing is they're evaluating Hadith in light of transmitters, right? They look at the Isnad and they ask, is everyone in the Isnad reliable? If everyone in the Isnad is reliable, all else being equal, it's a sound Hadith and you can accept it and it is, normative, right? You can base doctrine on it and so on and so forth. So what makes someone reliable then? For them, it's if someone is generally corroborated, then they are reliable. So if someone transmits something, and most of the time when they transmit something, there's a co-transmission, that's a sign that they are reliable, right? That's a reason to think that they're generally reliable so that you can trust them. So even when they transmit something that's uncorroborated, you can still accept it because they're generally reliable, right? And the way that they know if someone is reliable is if they're corroborated by other reliable people, right? This is the criterion. It's corroboration by another reliable person or by another famous person. Corroboration by a weak person means nothing, right? What they want is corroboration by other reliable people. And if you're corroborated by other reliable people, then you are also reliable. They also will look at different versions of the same hadith, and they'll try and adjudicate discrepancy. So if there's a major discrepancy, maybe in the isnad or a major contradiction in the matan, then they'll try and sort of resolve this, and they'll try and identify, okay, one of these is the erroneous version, so which one is that? And then they'll often appeal to like, well, which version is the less corroborated one? Like the version with more isnads, we're going to go with that. Or the version transmitted by the more reliable people, we're going to go with that version. Meanwhile, hadiths that are transmitted by unreliable traders, these are unsound, right? So this is their system. And so thereafter, you have the rise of prophetical. So after the rise of the people of hadith and their hadith critics, and remember, the people of hadith are saying we want to base things above all on prophetical hadiths. We have the rise of prophetical hadith collections that are entirely or almost entirely just prophetical hadiths, right? Hadiths from the Prophet. Initially, these are the musnad collections, right? And these are arranged by the companion transmitter. And these pop up in sort of early to mid 9th century, right? And there are some non-extant ones, but of the extant ones, we have Al-Humaydi, Ibn Hanbal, Al-Bazar, Abu Ya'la, and others. And again, Al-Humaydi's is available extant through a student redaction. Ibn Hanbal's technically is the redaction of his son, Abdullah. We also have, after that, further types of prophetical collections arising. So we have the Sunan collections. Again, these are prophetical, but these ones tend to have a legal emphasis, and they're arranged by topic, right? And this is across the 9th century. These are arising, Sa'id ibn Mansur, Ad-Darimi, Ibn Majah, Abu Dawood, and others, and Nasa'i as well, and others. We also have some that have the title Jamia, right? Kitabul Jamia, which are similar to the Sunan collections, but they tend to have more general topics. They have a higher percentage of like biographical hadiths as well, and exegetical hadiths as well, although they are still mostly legal. And these are the collections of Al-Bukhari, Muslim, and Tirmidhi. And so eventually, from the late 9th century and across the 10th century, several collections more and more are widely recognized among the people of hadith as being the most authoritative, right? And these are in order. These are the collections of Al-Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawood, Tirmidhi, and Nasa'i, and Ibn Majah, right? And in particular, Al-Bukhari's and Muslims are these, Kitab al-Jami' as-Sahih, right? They both have that same title. It's the book of the authentic hadith collection. You see what I'm saying? It's like these are the authentic hadith collections. And so both of these are regarded as being overwhelmingly or entirely or nearly entirely sound, right? So both of these have been given that sort of special title. It's the book of the authentic collection. And so others are not entirely authentic and contain weak hadith. Now you may ask why, and knowingly, by the way, like these other authors, Al-Bukhari and Muslim, tried to make collections of sound hadiths. The others have knowingly included weak hadiths. You might ask why. Actually, there's a good reason for this. There are two reasons. One would just be for study purposes. Like they also preserve weak hadiths. But the other reason is that just in case, right? We'll include these other hadiths that are weak, but just in case, right? Maybe they'll. I don't know, maybe further corroboration will be found or whatever, right? So they're also including weak hadiths as well, knowingly. So they'll signpost, like a Tirmidhi will say this one's weak or whatever. Okay, now just to go back to geography for a moment, you'll notice with these people where they're from, right? Transoxiana, Khurasan, Sijistan. There's a huge shift that happens in hadith scholarship. Initially, most hadith scholarship is occurring in these key regions. In Iraq, right, in the blue, in Greater Syria, in the yellow, and in the Hijaz, in the red. But there's a big shift from around 800 onwards, with the heart of hadith scholarship shifting to Iraq and to the east of Iraq, right? To these sort of former Sassanid territories, and especially Khurasan, and also Transoxania or Transoxiana, which is sort of like modern-day Uzbekistan, approximately. Okay, and so just to summarize then, the Sunni narrative, we have prophetic sunnah, right? Which is this sort of crucial, programmatic, concrete, comprehensive set of norms, laws, rules, etc. from the Prophet. This is mass transmitted from the Prophet to the companions, to the followers, to the followers of the followers, to the first systematic writers, to the Hadith critics, ultimately ending up in the canon and also in other collections as well. So sort of intergenerationally in the sort of the leading figures, especially in Makkah and Medina, in the Hijaz, Basra and Kufa, in Iraq and in Syria, but also in other places. And at times it's transmitted, initially it seems to be mostly transmitted orally, but also at times transmitted in writing. Okay, do you have any questions before we continue?
Not at the moment.
Right. So let's now turn to the Sunni narrative. Now you may be saying, wait a minute, didn't we just cover the Sunni narrative? Here's the thing. What we just covered is really the Sunni narrative from the Shafi'i and Hanbali point of view. But there's another way to tell this story from the Hanafi and Maliki point of view, right? And from a sort of a similar point of view to them. These aren't necessarily contradictory. You could understand these as being the same story with a different emphasis. This time, we're going to retell the same story, but this time it's a narrative or a similar story. It's a narrative of regional traditions, right? So just to remind ourselves, Muhammad is initially based in Makkah. He moves to Medina, then he ends up sort of taking over or conquering Makkah. After he dies, the great conquests of the Near East occur. Damascus is taken over. Basra is founded. The city of Basra is actually founded as a new colony by the Arab conquerors, Kufa as well, both in Iraq. And they'll also take over Hims as well in Syria. Damascus obviously is in Syria as well. And over time, these emerge as the dominant centers of Islamic learning. Makkah and Medina in the Hijaz, Kufa and Basra in Iraq, and then Syria is sort of left undifferentiated, right? And so these become the dominant centers of Islamic learning, right? And this is where like most lore is being transmitted, exegesis, history, and so on, right? So just to show on the map again, the two blue centers are Kufa and Basra. Just a reminder, Baghdad doesn't yet exist. That'll be founded by the early Abbasids in the mid to late 8th century, right? But before that, we have Kufa and Basra in Iraq. We have Medina and Makkah in the Hijaz, and we also have Syria. Again, Syria is normally left undifferentiated, although the major centers are Hims, Damascus, and Jerusalem. But I'm just going to speak of Syria as one block because that's what the traditional sources do as well. Every other major center is getting the overwhelming majority of its material from these 5 centers, right? Openly so, right? This is like, if you just look at what the Isnads say and what explicit reports say and so on, this is, openly acknowledged, right? So the overwhelming majority of, for example, the Hadith in Egypt is coming from the other regions, right? It's coming from Syria, it's coming from Iraq, it's coming from Medina. Yemen is getting most of its Hadith from Makkah, Medina, and from Iraq. And the East is getting most of its Hadith from Iraq, right? Sort of through, this sort of line of cities. Now this is only initially. This is only in like let's say like the first, 2 centuries, right? Obviously later on, everyone is going to have everything in some sense, right? Like collections containing hadiths from every region are going to end up sort of like in every region, right? So, but initially, this is my sort of estimation of sort of the main, my understanding of the sort of the main lines of transmission. So again, these are the 5 key early regional centers: Kufa, Basra, Medina, Makkah, and Syria. And these are or form into regional traditions, right? Or become dominated by regional traditions. When I say tradition, I sort of mean in the sense of like a school or a sect, right? But school and sect are both probably too formal, right? So but they're definitely traditions, right? There are traditions of law, traditions of exegesis, traditions of prophetical biography, right? And there definitely are traditions. There are sort of leading authorities in each generation. They have these sort of successive master-student relationships. They're also not just transmitters, they're authorities in their own right. So they're adding their own opinions as well. And they have distinctive doctrinal tendencies, right? You can correlate particular positions on doctrine with specific regions and sequences of master-student relationships, right? So they are traditions. We won't say schools, but they are regional traditions. And here's an example, by the way, of some of the differences. This is a statement attributed to the Syrian scholar Al-Awza'i. He reportedly said, "Rejected are the following. Amongst the doctrines of the people of Makkah, there are views on temporary marriage and the sale of currency. Amongst the doctrines of the people of Medina, there are views on listening to music and the permissibility of anal sex with women. Amongst the doctrines of the people of Syria, there are views on determinism and obedience to tyrants. And amongst the doctrines of the people of Kufa, the permissibility of alcoholic date wine and their view on the pre-dawn meal during Ramadan." So you can clearly see here that there are, not only is our author clearly aware of the different regional centers, but also that they have their own sort of mainstream doctrines, if you see what I'm saying. And there are sort of differences between the different regional schools. So to begin with, Makkah, right? This is the legal and also the exegetical tradition of Makkah, right? The key authority among the companions is Ibn Abbas, and then from him to the followers, Tawus, Mujahid, and Atta. And then to the next generation, key figures are Amr and Ibn Abi Najih. And then we also have in the next generation, Ibn Jurayj. And so this is sort of some of the key authorities, the key sort of network or sort of genealogy of the Meccan legal and exegetical tradition. We also have the legal tradition of Medina. Now, I'm simplifying. There are other figures in Medina. I mean, there are other major sort of influential companions and so on. But I'm trying to pick out here sort of the most important figures or the most prominent figures in the legal tradition. So we have Abdullah ibn Omar among the companions. We then have among the followers, we have the 7 jurists of Medina. But there are the different lists. There are different lists of who the 7 are, right? But the recurring figure and the most important figure is Sa'id ibn al-Musayyab. Then we have Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, and then Rabi'a, and then Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Ansari, and that continues on through Malik, very influential early Medinan jurist and hadith transmitter. He's sort of evaluating hadiths in light of local Medinan consensus and local Medinan custom. And then he has many major students coming from sort of, Egypt and North Africa and Spain. And this ends up producing the Maliki legal school, right? It spreads from Medina to Egypt, to North Africa, to Spain. We also have a biographical tradition in Medina, right? And the key figure here is, above all, Urwa. There are others as well, but the main figure is Urwa ibn Zubair. And then from him, his key student, Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri. And then from him, several key figures, Musa ibn Uqba, Muhammad ibn Amr, Hisham ibn Urwa, Muhammad ibn Ishaq, and then another subsequent key figure is Al-Waqidi. This is not just the biographical tradition of Medina. This is probably, we could also say, the biographical tradition of Islam, in a sense, because this tradition has just an absolutely gigantic impact on early Islamic biographical memory, shall we say. Az-Zuhri moves to Syria and he transmits there, right, all this material. And Muhammad ibn Amr, Hisham ibn Urwa, and Ibn Ishaq, they all move to Iraq and they disseminate this material there. And Al-Waqidi also moves to Iraq. And so the biographical tradition of Medina, it kind of is projected everywhere, if that makes sense, right? And so, like Ibn Ishaq, you may recognize this is the author of one of the first biographical collections, right? And then we have a recension of that. Well, we actually have several recensions, but the famous recension is that of Ibn Hisham. And Ibn Ishaq's work is being used by everyone, right? It's being used subsequently by the Khawarij, for example, and by other sects as well. It's sort of, you see what I'm saying? It ends up just sort of dominating the sort of biography of the Prophet in general, right? We also have a legal tradition in Basra, right? And we know less about the legal tradition of Basra than about the legal traditions, especially of, for example, Kufa and Medina, because just less autonomous Basran material has survived. So this is a little bit more approximate, but my sense is that these are the key figures of the Basran legal tradition. Samura, Anas ibn Malik, Ikrimah. Samura and Anas are companions. And then in the followers, Ikrimah, Hassan, and Ibn Sirin among the followers. And then in the next generation, Qatada. Now, Qatada technically sometimes transmits from a companion, but he's mostly transmitting from followers, right? Same for Az-Zuhri, by the way. Az-Zuhri occasionally transmits from a very sort of junior companion, but he's mostly transmitting from followers. And then we have also Sa'id ibn Abi Aruba. We also have an exegetical tradition in Basra, right? This is people transmitting material on the meaning and context of the Quran. And the main authority here is actually Ibn Abbas. He's mostly a Meccan figure, but I think he's actually the governor of Basra for a moment. And certainly the later Basrans like to cite him quite a lot. We also have among the followers, Abu al-Aliya and Ikrimah. And we also have then after that, Qatada, and then also Arabiya ibn Anas. There's also and again, I want to emphasize, in all of these cases that we're looking at, often these people are not just transmitters, they're also giving their own opinions, right? In all of these cases. Well, not really in the case of the biographical tradition, these are just stories about the Prophet, but in the legal and exegetical realm, these are all people who are also adding their own opinions. These are authorities in their own right, in addition to being transmitters from the Prophet. We also have the legal tradition of Kufa. So here we have Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, the major companion. We then have people who are known as the companions of Ibn Mas'ud, including Alqamah ibn Qais, who are, followers, but then there are other major followers as well, Ibrahim an-Nakha'i. He doesn't directly meet Ibn Mas'ud, so he's normally transmitting, when he does transmit, from the companions of Ibn Mas'ud. And we also have a Sha'bi as well. So these are the two leading sort of follower figures in the Kufan legal tradition. We also have Hamad ibn Abi Sulaiman in the next generation, and Muhammad ibn Abdurrahman ibn Abi Layla and Abu Hanifa in the generation after that, both very influential jurists. We also have Sufyan al-Thawri, Hassan ibn Salih ibn Hay, and then we have two key students of Abu Hanifa, Abu Yusuf and Ash-Shaybani, right? Just a quick note on their approach to Hadith. Abu Yusuf is evaluating Hadiths in light of the Quran and scholarly consensus. Ash-Shaybani tends to prefer companion Hadiths over follower Hadiths. And both of these are key students of Abu Hanifa, and through them, through Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf and Ash-Shaybani, and through their students, you have the emergence of the Hanafi legal school, right? From Kufa through Baghdad and out across the east. We also have an exegetical tradition in Kufa. We have Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. We have he moved to Kufa. We also have Ibn Abbas as well. Again, mostly a Meccan figure, but often cited in the Kufan exegetical tradition, especially through figures like Abu Salih Badham. We also have Abu Dhabiyan, Sa'id ibn Jubair, Atiyah ibn Sa'ad and his descendants. These are also key figures in the Kufan exegetical tradition. And then subsequently we have As-Suddi, who moves from the Hijaz, and Ata ibn As-Sa'ib as well. Finally, the legal tradition of Syria, right? And here again, the Syrian legal tradition doesn't survive very well, but my sense is that the key figures are among the companions, Mu'adh ibn Jabal, Abu Darda, Ubadah ibn As-Samit. And then we also have Umayyad caliphs who have a role in the legal tradition in Syria. And then among the followers as well, Makhul and Abu Idris al-Khawlani. And then in the next generation, we have, again, Az-Zuhri. He moves from Medina and has a big impact on the Syrian tradition. We also have, in the next generation, Al-Awza'i. Finally, I have to acknowledge an exegetical tradition in the East, right? So the East is, as you can sort of see here through like people like Ibn Jubair, it seems pretty derivative on like the Kufan tradition and on Basra, but there are some figures in the East who end up being very influential and cited a lot. So it's sort of worth also kind of thinking of also an Eastern exegetical tradition, which is probably an extension of the Iraqi exegetical traditions, right? So we have, they're often citing Ibn Abbas and Ibn Jubair, but we have Ad-Dahak and also Ikrimah, who we've seen before. He's sort of itinerant, travels around. And then we have also Ata al-Khurasani, Muqatil ibn Sulaiman, and Rabi' ibn Anas. We have the tafsir. Muqatil puts together a tafsir, which we have sort of a redaction of or a recension of, right? So this is a very important early figure in the sort of genre of actually writing down and creating tafsir works. Okay, so that's the regional traditions, right? There are probably others we could add and so on, but these are the main ones, I think. From the late 8th century onwards, we have the rise of people going around to different regions for hadith. So increasingly, hadith are starting to become sort of, you have these sort of trans-regional hadith transmitters that are beginning to arise, and the people of hadith arise, and the Proto-Sunni hadith criticism arises, and then you get the rise of the prophetical hadith collections and of the Proto-Sunni hadith canon, right? And so this ends up obscuring the original regional traditions, right? The hadith canon has sort of taken hadith, like prophetical hadiths from all these different regions and put them all together, right? So it's easy to forget that we have behind this these different sort of regional traditions. So the result is sort of a trans-regional hadith corpus. And eventually the Hanafis and the Malikis, they come to accept the hadith canon produced by the people of hadith. So that was a sort of a second way of understanding sort of the Sunni narrative. Do you have any questions?
Not so far.
Okay. Let's continue on to Shi'i narratives. And again, there are several different kinds of Shi'i traditions. There's a Zaydi tradition. There's an Imami/Twelver tradition. It goes back to before they became Twelvers, you see. So that back then we would call them Imamis, but they mostly then become the Twelvers over time. And then also there's the Ismaili tradition as well. And so all of them share a kind of common narrative, which is that, material is transmitted from the Prophet through Ali and his descendants as like a special kind of lineage of transmitters, and they're transmitting things from the Prophet. They're also adding their own statements as well. This passes through sort of Kufan students. Most of their followers are in Kufa. They then begin to write down all these sort of booklets preserving, sort of the sayings of the Imams. These end up then in collections, including these sort of extant collections. And so there, according to the Shi'i narrative, there is widespread fabrication by all their enemies, and even by some extreme Shia, right? From any given perspective, right? It's all relative, I guess. And so, including by the companions, the Shia think the companions mostly deviate. They mostly reject Ali. They don't stand by Ali and his descendants, who are the rightful rulers. And so the companions are actually not reliable for the most part. This is the common sort of Shi'i perspective. And so there's a Zaydi narrative, right? On the Zaydi view, the Prophet, there's a key sort of line of transmission from the Prophet to Ali's son Hussein, to his son Ali, to his son Zayd. That's where they get their name from, Zaydi. And then material passes on to, Kufan students like Amr ibn Khalid, but also there's a continuing sort of Zaydi lineage in Yemen and also in the Caspian region as well. And they're also transmitting things and producing works as well. And so here are some of the key Zaydi collections. I am not a specialist in Shi'ism. Just to clarify, this is not my area. We're really moving into a realm where I'm more and more relying on secondary literature here, just to clarify. And so some of the notable Zaydi collections include the Musnad Zayd, the Kitab al-Ahkam, and there are also some Caspian works as well, the Kitab al-Amali, and also the Kitab al-Amali al-Sughra, and the Kitab al-Jami' al-Kafi. And some of these are from the Caspian, some of these are from Kufa, and some of these are by imams, right? An-Natiq bil-Haq is an actual Caspian imam, also al-Mu'ayyad billah as well. So at some point, imams themselves are actually writing these or compiling these works. In terms of how they evaluate hadith, some of the sort of criteria you find in the Zaydi tradition is, does it fit the Quran? If it contradicts the Quran, it's out. Is it transmitted by this sort of key sequence of imams, right? They're reliable. Is it widely transmitted, right? Are there numerous sort of independent isnads? Is it supported by consensus? And is the content orthodox? These are some of their criteria for evaluating hadith. We also have the Imami/Twelver narrative. So things are transmitted from the Prophet through Ali, through several of his descendants, down to, and then the two key imams are Muhammad al-Baqir and Ja'far as-Sadiq. And they're both in Medina, but they mostly are transmitting to their Kufan students. The famous one is Zurara ibn A'yan. And then these students are beginning to write down booklets like Al-Halabi and Hariz. And then eventually this material ends up in collections. For example, Al-Himyari's Qurb al-Isnad, which is actually a source that I have used. Although again, I'm only sort of entering into sort of the use of Shi'i Hadith at the moment. So I'm everything here is much more tentative and based on secondary literature. And there ends up being sort of 4 books. The Shi'i, or I should say rather the 12er Shi'i sect produces sort of a canon of 4 books, right? Al-Kulayni's Kitab al-Kafi, Ibn Babawayh as-Saduq's Kitab Man la yahduruhu al-Faqih. I like that title. It's the book of the one whom there is not a jurist near him or present, right? So what do you do if you don't have access to a jurist? You read this book, right? And then we have Al-Tusi produces 2 books, the Tahdhib al-Ahkam and the Kitab al-Istibsar. And in terms of how the Imamis and the Twelvers are approaching Hadith, they think that their Imams are infallible. So there's an infallible line of Imamic transmission, right? So if it goes back to an Imam, it's good, right? They also emphasize the orthodoxy of tradents. Are the tradents, do they have the correct sort of theological views? Also, is the content correct? Is it orthodox? Also, is it consistent with the Quran or doesn't contradict the Quran? And also, is it sort of rational? These are all sort of criteria you can find in the Imami and Twelver tradition. There's also, we might say, an Ismaili narrative. They diverge at the point of al-Baqir. Let me go back for a moment, right? They accept the same lineage up to, I think, as-Sadiq, Ja'far as-Sadiq. And then they have a different lineage of Imams that they follow, all the way down to the present day, right? There are several competing Ismaili lineages into the present day. There are current Imams in the various Ismaili community. And the Ismailis are participants in the Imami Hadith tradition, right? And their sources are sort of citing the same, sort of Imami Hadith corpus to some degree. And their major scholar is An-Nu'man, the judge, right? Al-Qadi An-Nu'man, who's sort of a North African and Egyptian figure. And he has this famous work, Da'aim al-Islam. Unfortunately, he doesn't cite isnads, right? So it's very hard to use now the Ismaili Hadith tradition because the key work doesn't cite sources, right? And I'm sort of least familiar with the Ismailis, so I can't really say much more about them, unfortunately. Again, so obviously supplement everything that I'm saying with secondary sources, literature, etc. Primary sources if you can access them, but especially when I'm talking about the Shia and the Ibadis, because this is, I have the least sort of expertise on these, but I wanted to include them. Their narratives and their perspectives are often overlooked, so I'm including them. Do you have any questions before I continue to the Ibadis?
Sure. Are there circumstances where critical scholars will say that, okay, here's something in the Hadith, and I think what it's saying here is more reliable than what we see in the Quran when they're in conflict or something? Are there circumstances where that happens?
More reliable for what? Like for recovering the Prophet? Like what the Prophet said and did?
Yeah, basically.
I don't think so. I think it's generally thought that the Quran largely or wholly goes back to Muhammad, and so this is effectively like a documentary source from him, right? So we would always prioritize his direct source over any later oral tradition, right? There might be some circumstance where someone might prioritize a hadith or something, but I can't think of one. Right, overwhelmingly, we just prefer the primary sources over the secondary sources, or the early sources over later traditions. Hadith are all later traditions, so we prioritize the Quran if we're trying to understand Muhammad. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Any other questions?
That's it for now.
Okay, let's continue to the Ibadis. So, the Ibadi narrative, or again, narratives, they're, depending on what sources you're looking at, there are different ways to understand this, but okay, this is we'll just go with this for now, is that we have the Prophet, he transmits things to Ibn Abbas, and then there's a lot of transmission to, like, for example, Jabir ibn Zayd, right? And there are these other key figures as well among the followers who the Ibadis are often citing and transmitting from. Hassan in Basra, and Abdullah ibn Ibad is another important early figure who they have or attribute some letters to, and he's actually where they get their name from. In the next generation, we also have Qatada, an important figure who's often cited, and Abu Ubaidah, who's an early Ibadi Imam, right? So is Jabir as well. I think they regard him as a founder figure, and also Abu Ubaidah. And then things are also transmitted through Abu Ubaidah to a subsequent Imam, Rabi' ibn Habib. And most of these figures are in Basra. And then, things are then transmitted to later Ibadi Imams and Ibadi treatments, right? Maybe the key line of transmission is the Prophet to companions like Ibn Abbas, to Jabir, to Abu Ubaidah, to Rabi', and later on. This is their main channel for prophetical hadith, for example. Although they are also citing a lot of material from these other figures as well. And obviously they think that the impious followers of Uthman and Ali, people who become the Sunnis and the Shia and so on, they obviously think that these people are engaging in all kinds of fabrications and so on. And in terms of some of the sort of key Ibadi early works, we have the Jawabat, Jabir ibn Zayd, the Athar Rabi' ibn Habib, the Aqwal Qatada ibn Di'ama, and also the Kitab al-Salat and the Kitab al-Nikah. And in terms of like a sort of major sort of prophetical collection, the key Ibadi work is the Musnad Rabi' ibn Habib, also known as Al-Jami' al-Sahih, the sound collection, which is extant through al-Warjlani, right? A sort of 12th century Ibadi scholar in North Africa. And he sort of arranged it in its current arrangement. Okay. Finally, we've got to talk about the rationalists, I think, right? What do I mean by rationalism, early Islamic rationalism? Rationalism here is an approach to deriving doctrine, right? They are engaging in systematic deductive argumentation, right? They're trying to make sure that their system is logically consistent. They're engaging in argumentation by analogy, right? I'll give you an example. I'm just going to make up an example, right? Although this is done in the modern period, right? Alcohol is forbidden because it muddles the mind. Drugs also muddle the mind, therefore drugs are also forbidden. You can see how they're trying to consistently apply principles and so on. They're trying to say, well, if it's the case here, then that's going to apply here and so on. Now you might say, wait, doesn't everyone do that? No. The people of Hadith are not doing this, not initially. The people of Hadith are against this. Remember, they say Quran, Hadith. And if you don't have a Quranic verse or a sound Hadith text, La adri, I do not know. You do not take a position, right? So it's the rationalists early on who are actually sort of extrapolating things and trying to create sort of, using analogy and trying to create a sort of coherent sort of logical system, theological and doctrinal system. Rationalism isn't really a tradition, right? It isn't like the others we've looked at. It isn't really a sectarian tradition. It's sort of a common methodological tendency in Iraq from the mid-8th century onward. And it includes systematic theologians, right? The mutakallimun, especially, most famously, the Mu'tazila. So people sometimes treat these as synonymous, but they're not. There are rationalists who are not Mu'tazila, right? The Mu'tazila, to some degree, survive with the later Zaydis and Twelvers who adopt Mu'tazili theology, right? The proto-Hanafi jurists are also early rationalists, right? They're if you'll notice a lot of what I'm describing here aptly describes their efforts at their sort of legal work, right? Trying to be sort of systematic and using a lot of analogy and deduction and things like that. Also, there's a big overlap with early Hanafism and the Mu'tazila, or at least early on as well. Okay. So, what is the rationalist approach to hadith? The rationalists think that there was mass fabrication. Everyone everywhere is fabricating. All the different sects and factions and so on are fabricating. And in reaction to that, they have a sort of spectrum, right? There's a spectrum from skepticism to rejectionism, right? So among the rationalists, you find some of them are saying most hadith are suspect, or nearly all hadith are suspect, or all hadith are suspect, right? And here are some of the sort of notable early rationalists. There's Wasil ibn Atta. He's a Basran Mu'tazili, and he thought that you can only accept a hadith if it's like widely transmitted. And reportedly, he wanted at least 4 or more independent isnads, right, to accept a hadith. We have Amr ibn Ubaid, the Basran Mu'tazili, and he rejected hadiths that had doctrinally objectionable content. We have Abu Yusuf, who's a proto-Hanafi Kufan jurist, and he emphasized agreement with the Quran and the Sunnah, right? If it contradicts the Quran and the Sunnah, then you would reject it. And in particular, he's emphasizing, is it accepted by the majority of jurists, right? We also have Durar ibn Amr. He's a Kufan Mu'tazili, and he rejected all hadith in favor of the Quran and consensus. We have Abu Bakr al-Atham. He's a Basran Mu'tazili, and he appealed to the Quran, to reason, and to communal consensus, and he rejected hadiths with isolated isnad. So what he's demanding is widespread transmission, right? We also have An-Nizam, a Basran Mu'tazili, and he thought that all hadith and even consensus were suspect. And so he prioritized the Quran and reason, and either rejected all hadith or put a question mark on all hadith. We also have Abu al-Hudayl, a Basran Mu'tazili, and he emphasized widespread transmission. You need 20 or more independent isnads to accept a theological hadith, and you need 4 or more to accept a legal hadith, right? So we can see throughout these figures, there's like recurring ideas or features, right, in the rationalist approach to hadith. Hadith are being evaluated based on their content, right? If it contradicts the Quran, it's out. If it contradicts reason, it's out. There's also an emphasis on diffusion, and there are 2 iterations of this. The first is consensus, right? If a hadith is widely accepted, then it's accepted, and if it's widely rejected, it's rejected, right? And this could be either scholarly consensus or even the community as a whole. There's sort of 2 different ways that consensus is sort of cashed out. Another aspect of appealing to diffusion is the appeal to widespread transmission, right? To tawatur, right? Sort of widespreadedness, and so if hadiths are mutawatir, they're like very widely transmitted. They have numerous independent isnads, and then they're accepted. But if they only have a few or only one isnad, then they're in other words they're called ahad hadiths. Then they are like khabar al-ahad, or khabar al-wahid, right? The report of an individual, right, or of one. Then they are rejected. Okay, so just to summarize the traditional narratives of hadith origins, we have systematic transmission of programmatic teachings from the Prophet. This is sort of a common idea that you find. For the Sunnis, it's continuous intergenerational mass transmission all the way to the canon. For other Sunnis, I mean, they don't necessarily reject that, but they more focus on continuous intergenerational transmission within a specific regional community. We also have various sort of Shi'i narratives that emphasize sort of an imamic lineage of transmission to Kufan disciples. And then there's also a rationalist view that will accept some intergenerational widespread transmission, although they tend to be much more skeptical, as we've just seen. For each faction, fabrications were avoided or weeded out in contrast to all the rest. So each faction thinks that every other faction was mass fabricating hadith, but that they have managed to sort of avoid or weed out the fabrications. All right, this is sort of the end of sort of part 1, as it is, of the whole presentation. We'll now move on to sort of critical scholarship and so on.
All right, we've resumed.
Okay. Now, do you have any questions before we continue to the next part? Any questions about what we've covered thus far? Okay.
Not at the moment.
Let's continue. Okay. Right. Part 2. Critical scholarship and alternative models. So we're going to cover here, firstly, some of the critical scholarship on hadith, and the sort of then the actual problems that has been sort of identified by this scholarship, and then some of the sort of the alternative, or we could say revisionist models of the origins of Hadith. So, to begin with, the rise of critical scholarship. So this is the scholarly tradition that I am broadly part of, right? And so you could, then what do we call this tradition? It used to call itself Orientalism, although it no longer does, but you could call it the Orientalist tradition. People often call it Western scholarship, although that's kind of general. I mean, that also includes, study of Christian origins and so on. So there isn't really a good name for it right now. I tend to call it sort of critical scholarship or secular scholarship, but I don't know if we have a really good name. We could just say it's the cluster of disciplines now, Quranic studies, Hadith studies, Islamic origins, etc. And these are some of the key figures in particular the critical. So there are many more scholars involved, right, in the scholarly tradition as a whole, but these are really some of the standout scholars who made sort of really notable or important contributions to sort of the critical analysis of Hadith, right? I mean, there are others who could be mentioned here as well, and of course, many of these scholars disagree with each other on various points, and many of them are wrong on many things, etc., of course, right? But there's a lot of good insights you can get from all of these scholars together, and many others as well. So, what do I mean by critical? What am I picking out here, right? These are some of the recurring features of this approach, right? There's a systematic use of science and established background knowledge. When we're evaluating a report, a historical report, we evaluate it in light of modern science, right? It's also broadly, we could say, a secular approach, right? It does not assume the correctness of any given religion, and it excludes supernatural miracles, etc., as being wildly improbable. I mean, there's actually two approaches. One approach is just to exclude them sort of a priori, and not necessarily to deny that they exist, but just to exclude them from historical inquiry, right? That would be methodological naturalism, because it's hard to sort of even know what it means. Like if someone says, oh, what explains the great Arab conquests? Oh, well, it's God. It's like, what does that actually mean? Like if I say to you, what explains the conquests is that the Roman and Persian empires just had sort of an apocalyptic world war and absolutely demolished each other. Then the Romans won, but were massively degraded, and the Persian Empire fell into anarchy, and there was also a big plague. And at the same time, the Arabs coalesced under a sort of centralized leadership at the same time. So, that explains why they were so successful in their great conquests. I mean, when I say that, you can understand how it is you get from what I said to the success of the Arab conquest. You can actually see I understand, right? The Romans, it was harder for them to organize or to have the manpower or whatever, or they had fewer resources. The Persians are in disarray, so they're fighting. It actually makes sense. You know what I'm saying? But if I say it was God, this is like, what would that even mean as an explanation? Like, what are the mechanisms? It's like, do you see what I'm saying? Like, there's a sense in which we have to exclude sort of the supernatural because, it doesn't even really mean anything. They aren't really explanations per se. They don't actually explain in the way that normal things are actually explaining, where we actually understand what it means, what the mechanisms are, what the processes are, et cetera, et cetera. Do you see what I'm saying? Things can also be tested and verified and so on. So this is one approach to excluding the supernatural, is that it's just, it isn't really explanatory, right? It's like just saying what explains it. Oh, it's blah, blah. It's explained by blah, blah. Like there's no content really. You see what I'm saying? There's no mechanisms. There's nothing. So that's one approach. The other approach is just prior probability. Obviously, so this is not even necessarily saying that these things are supernatural. The point is just, there's a category of events or putative events and phenomena that are far, 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 far more likely to be explained. Reports of them are far more likely to be explained by some sort of false creation than that they actually happened, right? So, if there's a report of someone levitating, that is just extremely likely to be the product of some sort of false creation rather than that someone levitated, right? I'm not saying people can't levitate or something. I have no principal argument against, maybe you could, maybe it's advanced technology, right? It's logically possible. But, if you have a report of someone levitating, right, in say a pre-modern source, right, then it's probably false, et cetera, right? So either way, whichever direction you come at it, whether you take that more sort of philosophical issue of, the supernatural or whether you go with the prior probability, where we reject these kinds of things. Another aspect of the critical approach is that, and this is really, I think, like when people talk about, for example, historical critical, this is the sense, right? Is that the approach is critical of received sources and received narratives, right? It interrogates tradition. That isn't to say that we reject everything, right? For example, the traditional narrative in Islamic sources, the traditional Islamic narrative of the canonization of the Quran, of the rasm of the Quran, the underlying consonantal text, is that it was canonized by Uthman, the Caliph Uthman. This is definitely correct. The evidence for this is overwhelming. There are so many independent converging points of evidence that all strongly point to this. There's just no contest, right? That's also a traditional narrative, right? But we don't just accept it because it's the traditional narrative. We interrogate it, we find the evidence, and then we say, yeah, in this case, it checks out. In other cases, it doesn't check out, right? So we don't accept these sort of received and traditional narratives at face value. We test them. See what I'm saying? So we're critical of received sources. We also, another tendency of this scholarship, which is not widely recognized, but something that I notice in a lot of the scholarship, is uncovering the non-face value explanatory potential of sources. So, for example, even if a source is formally fabricated, it can still be useful for evidence. Like if I have a report attributed to Shu'bah, right, that major hadith scholar, it doesn't matter if it's fabricated, right? Like the report when Shu'bah says, I don't know, 3/4 of all hadith are false, right? My using that source as evidence of early mass fabrication is not dependent on accepting that it actually goes back to Shu'bah. It doesn't matter. Even if it doesn't go back to Shu'bah, even if it's fabricated, it still shows us what someone thought, right? Somebody in hadith circles thinks that hadith are being mass fabricated, which is evidence of mass fabrication, right? That someone is perceiving this around them. You see what I'm saying? Like, there are ways that we're like, it's like not accepting sources at face value, but you can still bring out their evidentiary value. This is an interesting tendency of this scholarship that I don't really see, for example, in traditional scholarship. Another a recurring feature of this kind of scholarship is that it reconstructs evolution, development in texts, traditions, doctrines, etc. Right? And finally, and this isn't always the case, but disproportionately, it attempts to explain history, not just saying this happened and then this happened. We're also trying to figure out why it happened. What are the causes, right? And there are different levels of causation, right? But this is at least something that I disproportionately notice of this tradition as well. So I'm going to include it as a kind of characteristic. Some of these things you can find in other like pre-modern scholarship, like Ibn Khaldun is explaining history, right? Or trying to explain history. Like we saw systematic use of science and established background knowledge. The rationalists that we just talked about, a lot of what they're doing could be understood like this, actually. When they're appealing to reason and the intellect and things like that, they may actually be appealing to like established background knowledge and things like that. Not just the rationalists. You can even find this in the classical Sunni Hadith tradition, where, like, for example, there's a Hadith about how Adam was, a giant, and then over time humans have been getting smaller and smaller. But the point is that for a long time humans were giants. This Hadith is questioned because it contradicts archaeological evidence. I mean, questioned in the medieval period, right? So I'm not saying all of this is unique. You can find sort of analogs and instances of this kind of stuff in other scholarly traditions as well. But these are sort of characteristic of the scholarly tradition that I'm in. And not just that I'm in, I mean, this is the same as in biblical studies. This is the same approach really taken in the study of all religions and history and so on in the secular academy. It's the same general approach, right? And there's a famous quote from Patricia Croner who said, "I have simply refused to treat the Arabs as an exception to the normal rules of history. And something is badly wrong in Islamic studies if I have to justify this procedure." Now, this is a kind of a polemical statement, right? So I don't necessarily endorse Croner's polemical language, but the point is right? As in, it's reasonable to approach, Hadith and early Islamic history and so on in the same way that we approach the others. If we find the same signs, the same evidence, the same mechanisms, then we can draw similar conclusions. That doesn't mean we should like mechanically treat early Islamic history the same as early Christian history. Just like the Bible took a long time to emerge, therefore the Quran must have taken a long time to emerge. It's not necessarily the case, right? So you shouldn't just but when you find similar conditions or similar mechanisms, it's reasonable to think that there are similar outcomes. When you find similar signs of evolution and so on, then it's reasonable to think, okay, we're dealing with evolution just like in every other case. So this is just sort of to contextualize the approach. Okay. So what are the problems? Oh, do you have any questions before we continue?
Nope.
Okay. Problems with Hadith. I don't want to spend too much time on this because I've already gone into this in a lot of detail in other podcasts, but I'll just quickly summarize this. There are a lot of problems with Hadith, right? I've got obviously at least 25 here. Firstly, there's prior probability of mass fabrication. We see this with early Christianity, early Judaism. We would expect the same thing with early Islam, especially given that there are sort of similar kinds of mechanisms or conditions. And there are rapidly changing early conditions, which incentivizes people to try and rationalize and justify all these ever-changing new sort of interests and positions and doctrines in the absence early on of a canon. Well, that the predictable outcome is going to be mass fabrication. There are also explicit reports of mass fabrication, right? There are all kinds of reports going in every direction. The Iraqis, they're all liars, or the Syrian hadiths are all fables, or I've never seen animals more dishonest than the people of Hadith. That's a report I found recently, recorded by Ibn Adi from Abd al-Razak. And so on and so on. There are all these kinds of reports going in every direction about mass fabrication and so on, right? So that's reasonable to expect. Okay, well, Hadith were being mass fabricated. The sources are quite late, the extant sources, and even when we sort of do kind of source critical reconstructions of earlier sources, we still end up many decades after the Prophet. And so, obviously the later a source is, the more time there is for distortion, fabrication, error, etc. to occur. The sources are obviously extremely biased. They're all biased in all kinds of different particular ways, but also just fundamentally biased to try and make the Prophet look good, to try and make Islam seem true, etc., etc. So we can't. It's hard to trust it when it comes to early enemies whose perspectives are not independently recorded. Everything has gone through an Islamic filter. You see what I'm saying? So even if they're descendants live on, there's no it's you would not expect their perspective to live on. See what I'm saying? Everything would be conformed to the sort of the new regime, the new set of pressures, the new common set of interests. So we don't have independent access to the early Jewish perspectives, the Jewish enemies of the Prophet, or the Medinan enemies, the Munafiqun, or whoever, etc., etc. The so-called false prophets of Arabia. We don't have independent access to their perspectives. So that's a problem. Propaganda. There's just a lot of propaganda in Hadith, just obvious examples where it's you have all these Hadiths that look exactly like they've been made up for very specific rival causes, right? Ones that make Ali look really good, and ones that make, the Prophet, used to go camping with Abu Bakr, Omar, and Uthman. It's the first three caliphs who were specifically regarded as legitimate caliphs by an early dominant tendency, the early Uthmani sort of theological tendency in early Islam, dominant in the Hijaz and Syria and Egypt early on. It's oh, that's funny. It's very suspicious. These are red flags when you find all these sort of later or particular sort of factional interests exactly embodied in Hadith. There are also lots of anachronisms in Hadith, not just pseudo prophecies referring to later events, but also just like terminology and stuff of later institutions are sort of retrojected back to the Prophet. Obviously, they're full of miracles and supernatural phenomena as well of all kinds. They depict implausible scenarios. It's just stuff like people convert for no reason, and other people refuse to convert when they're presented with miracle after miracle after miracle. And it's just does that seem plausible? There's just, there's a lot of it isn't contradicting science, but it sort of contradicts our general background knowledge, We have internal contradictions. Hadith are incredibly contradictory overall, right? I mean, just even one sort of area that I've obviously researched is hadiths about Aisha's marriage, not just her marital age, which is what my doctoral dissertation was on, but I've also researched just hadiths about the marriage in general. What was the day? What was the context? What happened on the day? What was the ceremony like? Who arranged the marriage? And there is just a staggering number of contradictions on this like minor episode in the life of the Prophet, right? I mean, I'm sure it was important for Aisha in some sense, in the Prophet, but in the grand scheme of things, this is the Prophet marrying a wife is a side point in his career, right? And there are so many contradictions. It's really wild. There are also external contradictions. Hadith on many key points contradict early, non-Muslim sources and archaeological evidence and so on, right? There's also like implausible transmission. Like there are hadiths where like they're recording like the internal conversations of the enemies of the Prophet, and it's like who's present? What spy is like wiretapping this phone call? Do you see what I'm saying? It's like, how do they have access to these conversations? Or like other reports are about like the Persian ruler was said this to his advisors. It's like, who is there? So there's all this implausible transmission. This is, I'm sure, is a very familiar problem from New Testament studies, right? Where it's like, who's the witness to the trial of Jesus and all that sort of stuff. Lateness of isnads. So the system of providing sources and checking sources begins in the second fitna, begins in like the 680s, 690s, and becomes widespread over the next few decades, up through like to like the 720s or something, is approximately when the usage of isnads is becoming sort of widespread. So that means that before this point, transmission was overwhelmingly anonymous, right? Which is perfect conditions for all kinds of false information to just proliferate, right? And there are various sort of strong independent points of evidence that attest to this, right? Like there are contradictory reports on this. There are other reports that want to say, oh, isnads began after the first fitna, right? Much earlier, when all these major companions are all still alive and so on. But there's various independent reports and other points of evidence that strongly indicate that it's actually the second fitna, and this is supported by the criterion of dissimilarity as well, right? Goes against the grain. What else do we have here? Oh, inconsistency with archaic sunnah. This one's very interesting. So I mentioned, right, that sunnah is the classical sunnah, the sunnah in the traditional narratives, is the normative practice of the Prophet. But if you look at various reports, they also depict sunnah as being like there's the sunnah of Abu Bakr, and there's the sunnah of Omar, and there's the sunnah of other people. And you should follow the sunnah of David and Solomon from the Bible, right? Or there's also just generic sunnah. People often cite sunnah, it's just the sunnah. Not with the Prophet, nothing, right? And time and time again, if you look at the earliest sources, right, like all these early sort of ascriptions to and like edicts and like documents that are preserved in later sources, but that based on the content can be, and like criterion of dissimilarity and so on, can all be pushed back into like the Umayyad period, right? Like theological epistles and so on, all this stuff. The overwhelmingly, again and again, it's like sunnah is just nominal. It's just like vaguely the right thing to do, right? So we have both sunnah as all kinds of different sunan, from all kinds of different figures are present, including the Prophet, but from others as well. And also, sunnah is just doesn't have any content at all. Do you see what I'm saying? So that you can sort of see like different kinds of sunnah flowing throughout the early period. There's like sunnah is just nominally, vaguely, like it's sort of like, what would Jesus do? What would Jesus do is not programmatic. There's no content there. When someone, when a Christian says like, what would Jesus do or whatever, they're just vaguely thinking what sort of is the thing that sort of embodies his spirit or something. Do you see what I'm saying? Sunnah is like that early on, overwhelmingly, actually. It comes across again and again across all kinds of different sources. It's just vaguely the right thing to do, right? And there is also sunnah more in the sense of concrete precedents, but we have all these other figures alongside the Prophet being cited, and even when the Prophet's sunnah is cited, it's mostly not the concrete kind. It's just this vague right thing to do or something. See what I'm saying? And so we find this across the board. Also, like in the early Ibadi tradition as well. If you take out the much later work of al-Wajlani, which scholars seem to agree is a later fabrication, and you look at all the early Ibadi works, Same thing we find. Everything I just described from the early documents, the early theological epistles, and so on, the same thing is attested in the early Ibadi works, right? So the evidence for this is very strong all across the board in all kinds of different places, in different sects and so on. We find again and again early on that there are all kinds of non-prophetical figures who are being sources of Sunnah, and the Prophet Sunnah, when it is cited, is mostly just vague and there isn't actually any specific content and so on. It's very hard to square this with the idea that there were 10,000 prophetical hadiths mass transmitted everywhere in every major region by the major figures in every region right from the get-go. How on earth can that be squared with this much stronger evidence supported by the criterion of dissimilarity and in the earliest identifiable sources that presents a very different picture? You just have to think that somehow everyone everywhere just abandoned hadith for some reason, right? It just seems like absurd, right? Why would they do that? I mean, later on, every sect is citing hadith, right? Like, if they didn't like the hadith that existed, they would have just made up hadith of their own, which is what everyone does later on. So you can't say, oh, well, they were all just didn't like hadith. That doesn't really explain it, because what's depicted is that everyone already has hadith already on a mass scale everywhere early on. Do you see what I'm saying? So it doesn't make sense. If hadith were there, you'd expect all these people to be citing at least all of the benign hadiths. And if they were hadiths that contradicted them, they would just be making up their own, right? So that is like a terrible explanation to try and sort of say, oh, well, they're all just heretics. Like, that doesn't explain it at all. So anyway, this is a serious problem that we have. Okay. Related to that is initial absence. So, okay. It's hard to understand. So I've sort of conflated two issues there, right? Number one is just Sunnah. It just seems clear that early on people don't have this concrete, massive, programmatic sense of prophetical Sunnah, which is really, really weird if they have access to a giant prophetical canon, right? Already from the or corpus, right from the get-go. So that's one point, is that their very notion of Sunnah that is clearly widespread early on, it seems inconsistent with there being a massive prophetical corpus concretely from the get-go. In addition to that, when we look at the earlier sources, they're not citing hadith, right? And then they begin to appear over time. The later we go, the more hadiths start to appear. And initially, it's mostly from the followers and then companions, and last of all, prophetical hadith. And it's only when we reach the 9th century that you have these primarily prophetical collections, right? And there are also reports of early figures who only have a few hadiths, and then later on, they're attributed many more hadiths. It just looks like hadith are growing. They're not initially there, then they begin to appear more and more, and then they're growing, right? We also have an interesting phenomenon of raising, right? This is rafa in Arabic, right? So this is acknowledged by the hadith critics. They are aware that hadith are being raised, right? So what that means is a hadith starts out as a statement attributed to a companion, and then someone adds in to the isnad the prophet. So it goes from being the statement of a companion, it gets raised back to being the statement of a prophet. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right. This is acknowledged by the hadith critics. The problem, though, is that it was clearly much more widespread than they acknowledged, right? Or to put it another way, there are lots of cases of raised hadiths that are obviously raised, where we can find an unraised parallel version, which is supported by the criterion of dissimilarity. It's much more likely someone would take a companion hadith and turn it into a prophetical hadith, and that they would take a prophetical hadith and turn it into a companion hadith, right? And there's no reason to leave out the prophet, but there's a reason to add the prophet. See what I'm saying? So it's much more likely that the original is the unraised version. We find so many examples. Every time I investigate a set of hadith, right? I'm not saying every single hadith, but I'm saying every single big set of hadith on a topic, I'm always finding examples of raisings. It happens over and over and over. It is incredibly widespread. And there are cases of raised hadiths that are judged to be sahih and accepted by hadith critics, but they are clearly raised. We can find parallel unraised versions of the same hadith. I give some examples in my doctoral dissertation, for example. And there have been many cases that have been documented. So this is a serious problem. We also have hadiths that are the products of debates and developments. So the idea here is that you can, with some issues and some debates, you can actually take the hadiths and put them into a dialectic, right? Like the first position is this, and then this one is responding, and then this hadith is clearly trying to refute this hadith. They form into a back and forth argument, right? And so if a hadith is sitting in the third position and looks like it's the product of this debate, it's not authentic. It looks like it's been created after and in relation to this ongoing debate. You see what I'm saying? And so this is another problem that we find. There's also regional bottlenecks in transmission. We already discussed this to some extent. I mean, obviously, like the overwhelming majority of all this like really pro Ali stuff goes back to Kufa. There's like a massive sort of Kufan bottleneck for the overwhelming majority of sort of that kind of material. Well, this is a problem because that's just what it would look like if early Shia are just creating all this material, right, for their cause. See what I'm saying? Or like take, for example, a lot of the biographical material. It all goes back to this coterie of key interlinked Medinan figures who are in sort of in the same place at the same time, sort of next to each other, you know, across the generations. This is perfect conditions for false things to just pop up and then be generalized everywhere. This is the problem of a bottleneck, is that it undermines independent transmission. See what I'm saying? If it's all in the same region with going through the same people, it calls into question that these are actually independent. They claim that, oh yeah, independent isnads, but these are the perfect conditions for borrowings and so on to occur. Another problem is the mode of transmission, which is that it was oral, paraphrastic, atomistic in fast-changing conditions. This is like the worst conditions you could have in terms of creating sort of rapid distortion, mutation, etc. Right? These are the conditions to obliterate information in the course of transmission. Right? Like things are being paraphrased, but in the new context, so they get misunderstood and rephrased, and suddenly the whole meaning has changed. Right? Okay. A simple example to illustrate the concept is the telephone game. Right? Is that the American name? It's the game of telephone, right?
Yeah.
Other cultures often have a specific like ethnic or cultural name for it that reflects their perception of who is incomprehensible, right? So obviously in Commonwealth English, it's called Chinese whispers. And then I think in French, maybe it's Arab telephone. And then in other languages, it's like Greek telephone. And so it tells you something about the stereotyping of the culture. You know what I'm saying? There's something, anyway, that's another topic. But there's something interesting going on there sociologically. Anyway, about sort of the racist stereotyping of the culture. Anyway, putting that aside, whatever we call the game, I'm going to call it telephone. This is, it's kind of like that, right? Now telephone is a game. Obviously it's not, it's an analogy, okay? I'm not saying it's a game of telephone. But the point is that things these are the perfect conditions for things to be constantly shifted and reworded to the point of obliterating the content and even the gist, right? We also see a lot of growth and elaboration as we look at traditions over time. We compare traditions. We can see they get more and more elaborate. Details are being added in and so on. They're growing, right? Not just numerically growing, but growing in their content. You see what I'm saying? And we also can observe extreme distortion and mutation. So it isn't just what we would expect given the conditions. It's what we can actually sort of see. You can line up hadiths. So I've done this in case after case after case. You can find so many cases of hadiths where each hadith overlaps with another hadith that overlaps with another hadith, but by the time you get to the end, it's a different hadith, right? Which show like it's sort of like the product. Now, I'm not saying each one is directly dependent on the other, right? They're all sort of different sort of co-descendants from earlier forms that are changing and changing and changing. But you can see there this sort of extreme mutation in action. Whereas you go from one version to another, it's like the gist is changing, right? We also have artificial narrative structures in hadiths. So this is just like tropes and motifs and stuff, right? Like obviously, like in modern like cinema, right? Like how many times have you watched a movie and the antagonist says to the protagonist, "You and I are more alike than you realize," right? I mean, we've heard that a million times, right? So we've heard that over and over. Why? Because that's how people make movies. They like to sort of use and reuse similar kinds of elements and scenarios and stuff when they make movies. Ancient literature is like that. That's how people are making a lot of ancient literature. They're actually using these sort of ideal genre-specific kinds of character archetypes and statements and tropes and things like that. Hadith is like that, right? You find over and over the same kinds of things are happening, the same kinds of actors are appearing, the same questions are being asked over and over and over, right? You know, the prophet is recognized by a pre-Islamic representative at a younger age who sees a special sign, on his body or something, like a special birthmark or something. and then it recognizes that he's the true prophet. And then, but it's in this one, it's some Jewish rabbis, or in this one, it's a Christian priest in Syria, and this one, it's an Ethiopian, and this one, it's a pagan soothsayer. And it's like, but it's the same archetype in every case. It's the same scenario. It's like, did this thing happen over and over and over in the same way in all these different instances? No, it's clearly the much more likely explanation is they're just tropes, archetypes, motifs, schemata. These are artificial narrative structures that people are using over and over to build hadith. And this is a serious problem, because if you're using artificial narratives, you're replacing or doing so in lieu of what actually happened, what was actually said, who actually was. You see what I'm saying? So artificial narrative structures sort of inherently are kind of eroding history in a sense. We also have clear signs of storyteller construction, right? We find, and this is sort of connected to these, right? It's sort of a combination of these leads to a further point, which is that when we find hadiths, right, we find that in many cases, with narrative hadiths in particular, we find that there are other hadiths that have, what am I trying to say? You'll find hadiths that form a continuum of overlapping material where it's like the same set of characters, motifs, and elements keep reappearing in different combinations, right? And when you can, and that's what it looks like when people are making stories, like professional storytellers, oral storytellers, performative storytellers, where they have a kind of stock set of elements that they remix in different iterations at different times for different audiences, right? Or they remix previous stories and change them for their own purposes. And so it's just what we would expect, just in principle, to flourish in an early sort of oral context. But we have the clear signs of their activity as well, right? That sort of very distinctive, characteristic storyteller construction by combining and recombining a common set of material. We also have exegesis in disguise. So when we look at exegetical hadith, not only are they wildly contradictory, where you have 5, 10, 15, whatever, different explanations for the same verse, but they all sort of match the verse, and also often they're all narrative as well. So it's like, well, clearly most of this is false. It looks like no one actually remembered what it was, or almost no one remembered what it was, or what the meaning was. And so what's going on in general then clearly is people are just making things up. But they're making things up that in each case matches the Quran. So they're not actually independently preserving what the Quran's context was. They're looking at the Quran, and then they're kind of engaging in sort of inferences or suppositions or guesswork, and they're trying to explain. They're exegeting the Quran. But then that's being disguised as if it's, this is a historical memory. Do you see what I'm saying? But it's actually not. They're just, each different person is looking at the Quran, coming up with a different scenario, and then that gets passed off as if it's, just like a historical memory. It's actually not. It's just exegesis later on by people who would, and this brings us to the next point, people who are disconnected from the original context. There's a lot of amnesia and discontinuity, right? Where people clearly have, when they have all these different contradictions about the context of the Quran, and in many key cases, even the meanings of some specific words, it looks like people don't remember, right? There's just this widespread kind of amnesia or discontinuity. People don't have genuine memories of what this was about, and so they're just guessing, and different people are guessing in different ways. And this is particularly the case when we can actually tell, based on our greater access to just general contextual knowledge, like maybe it's like comparative, like linguistics, like, knowing other languages, or having access actually to the kinds of texts and traditions that the Quran is actually engaging with. We can actually figure out often what the Quran was referring to, and it's not what the exegetes are saying. The exegetes are way off, right? A classic example is Surah 112, which is a short sort of almost like creedal statement, right? Say it is the case that God is one. He is Al-Samad. We don't really know what Al-Samad means. He neither begat nor was he begotten, and there is nothing, or there's no one equivalent to him, or there's no one like him, right? This is the surah. This is very clearly a kind of remix, a kind of polemical remix of the Nicene Creed, or sort of post-Nicene traditions, right? Where it's sort of almost going like line by line or section by section, and where it agrees, it says it, and then when it disagrees, it inverts it or changes it. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's a very clever kind of remix and response to the Nicene Creed or sort of Nicene traditions. This is totally gone in the Islamic historical memory. There is no memory that this is what the Prophet is engaging with, or what the Quranic audience is engaging with. Totally gone. Instead, they mostly are the storytellers are at it, and they're like, oh, it was this Jew or that Jew or this one or this pagan or that pagan or this Bedouin, and then it's there's no memory. And they do once or twice mention Christians, but they mention them as they're just reaching for suitable characters to say the same things that the Jews are made to say and the pagans are made to say, and so on. None of which actually is a memory of what this was really about and what it was responding to. Okay, there are lots of cases like this. Okay, now I'm not saying everything was forgotten, right? I do think actually a lot of stuff has been preserved, but it's just there's also a lot of discontinuity and amnesia as well. Finally, the sort of a kind of almost a meta problem is that there was no effective countermeasure. They had no effective way of dealing with almost all of these problems. This is the case demonstrably. Like almost all the problems I just summarized, you can find in so-called Sahih Hadith. You can find across the Sahih canon. Not so much contradictions, actually. I think because there's a simple reason for that. The Proto-Sunni Hadith critics were specifically trying to weed out contradictions, right? So they would, if they found two hadiths that are Sahih, that are contradictory, they would just find a reason to reject one. Right? It's almost like formalistic. It's like this hadith they would have accepted otherwise, but because it contradicts another one, they then find a reason to reject one. So they've generally weeded out contradictions, at least between Sahih hadiths, although not always. You can find contradictory statements about, oh, this one is Sahih, or actually this one is Sahih, and it's contradictory hadiths. But it's much less of a problem. The contradictions is much less of a problem. Everything else, though, doesn't make a difference. All of these kinds of problems you find, regardless of whether it's declared to be Sahih, or whether it's not Sahih, whether it's Sunni or Shi'i or Ibadi, there's no difference, right? It's just, these are just general problems. So that just shows demonstrably, right? Like this is kind of like an external test. It's like, did their methods work? Let's look at the results. And by almost every single metric you could use, they didn't work, right? They were extremely ineffective / didn't work. Do you see what I'm saying? Also, though, if you just think about the methods, you can sort of see why they don't work, just sort of conceptually, right? Like if a hadith matches the Quran, that doesn't mean that it's authentic. You can have a false hadith that matches the Quran. If a hadith matches local custom, it could also just be made up. Alternatively, maybe local custom is wrong. So a hadith that contradicts local custom could be true, right? Or a hadith that conforms to the intellect or something, right? Well, that could be false. Or hadiths that conform with your doctrine. That could easily be a false hadith, right? Or even in the case of the corroboration. Remember, it's always corroboration by reliable figures. This is in the Proto-Sunni Hadith criticism proper. So then, what's the starting point for this analysis? If the way you establish if someone is reliable is that they are corroborated by other reliable people, how are those other reliable people established? What it actually looks like, and what makes sense historically, is that the Proto-Sunni Hadith critics have grandfathered into their system a bunch of people who they've just sort of assumed from the get-go are generally reliable, which makes sense. I mean, the Hadith critics arise at a secondary point, right? So they're obviously preceded by teachers of Hadith who are not themselves Hadith critics. Do you see what I'm saying? So it makes sense that they would sort of inherit a kind of veneration for their great masters, who they then are going sort of, they're being lenient in their judgments towards them. And if you look at how they're criticizing things, you can actually find easy stratagems that they are plausibly employing to not impugn people. So when someone has, by even their own standards, reliable and unreliable transmissions, they can say, he was reliable until something happened. Right? Like when he got older, right? And so all the reliable transmissions, you can say, they're from his reliable phase. And then all the unreliable ones, they're from the unreliable phase. This is just a way of saving someone who you might otherwise just think is unreliable, right? Because they have a lot of unreliable transmissions. You can say, the reliable ones are from the reliable phase, and the unreliable ones are from the unreliable phase. But part of an indication of this is that when you look at what caused the unreliability, and then you have it's like the storyteller thing, or it's like the exegesis thing. It's like, he became old and senile. He lost access to his books. Actually, he whacked his head. And it's like, right. So it looks like people are kind of inferring. Do you see what I'm saying? But then why not just think he was generally unreliable? Why? So would be one stratagem they could have used that is a way of saving people. Other ways of doing it is just to say, oh, people are just making mistakes, right? Rather than that they're doing it deliberately. So there are various stratagems that they could have used. But the basic point is that it just looks like that there's a set of people they're starting with, which is how it makes sense that the analysis then proceeds, because it's always in reference to a starting point of reliable people, that they're just inheriting people who actually were not reliable, there are plausible cases where we can actually see this, where there are people who are like supposed to be reliable and it looks like they've fabricated hadith. We can actually find a few examples of this. But anyway, that's, even if they weren't outright fabricators, the point is that it looks like even the proto-Sunni hadith criticism with this emphasis on establishing corroboration has a huge weakness, which is the start of the method conceptually and historically, which is having a starting pool of thiqat, of reliable people. And that's, it's easy to see how things have gone wrong there by just sort of grandfathering in people who are not actually reliable into their system. Another problem is that what actually counts as corroboration, right? Like there are times when sometimes I'll just say, well, oh, there's, have some independent isnads, so it's corroborated. Okay. And there are other times when they're independent isnads and they say, oh no, those are actually errors. It's like, well, so then how do you know which independent isnads are the error ones and which ones are the corroboration? Now, if you're going to say, oh, it's because it has reliable people, say, no, but we want to know why they're reliable in the first place. You see what I'm saying? It all becomes quite, difficult and made more difficult by the fact that they don't give arguments. The hadith critics don't give arguments. When you look through a work of hadith criticism, even in the works of Ilalul Hadith, the genre of subtle defects in hadith, there's almost no arguments, right? They'll give some data and they'll give a conclusion. What they don't give is the reasoning, right? So we just have to look at these ultra generic statements of principle that we find in some reports and in some introductions to some works about like, oh, we're appealing to corroboration. But what that actually means on the ground in any given instance, how people are actually applying this and practicing this, it's all very opaque, right? For the overwhelming majority of judgments, there's no argument. And there isn't even evidence in most cases. There's just a judgment. And there's just Ahmad ibn Hanbal said, Yahya ibn Ma'in said, and you just have to go with that. And you either accept it or reject it, right? Although you could try and infer by some other evidence, like if they were successful or not, which is what we've already done. We find they weren't successful. We find endless problems with their material, right? Like really strong problems. So we just think, well, their system didn't work. On top of that, there are also reports of people using intuition, right? There are statements attributed to early hadith critics that indicate that they're actually going off sort of a gut feeling at times, right? Which sort of makes sense. Right? If you think about like, how is someone actually establishing if someone is corroborated? You'd have to collect so much data, like it'd be staggering, right? Like you'd have to like write a dedicated monograph for each individual person, right? It would just be like for every single person, you collect all their reports, and then you collect all the corroborating reports for every one of those reports. You see what I'm saying? It would end up being so gigantic. It makes sense that actually what's going on, and this matches the reports of intuition and so on, that people are going off like a subjective impression. Like most of the time, what people are actually doing is, in my perception, if I just sort of introspect and think about my general experience, is this person normally corroborated, right? Which may work much of the time. The problem, though, is that if you're doing that, you become very vulnerable to your biases. So if you really like someone or you venerate someone, you're more likely then to not impugn them or something if you're just going off intuition or something subjective like that. Anyway, so it's easy to see. You can sort of read between the lines to some degree, and you can see what's gone wrong, even with sort of proto-Sunni hadith criticism. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Do you have any questions about that?
No, I think you covered the basis.
Right. Okay. We're nearly done. Okay. Sorry, this is going on so long. Okay. So what are the outcomes of all these problems, right? There's a general skepticism towards hadith, right? This is across the field, right? Especially since the 70s, I would say. There's this very widespread kind of sense that any given hadith should be presumed to be unreliable or suspect until the contrary can be demonstrated, right? And so you just find this is now sort of the operational sort of principle across the board in the scholarship. And so what this also means is that there's now space for revisionist reconstruction. It's not just space, but in fact, a lot of the problems strongly suggest in various different ways that what has happened is different from the traditional received narrative or traditional received narratives. And so you end up with these sort of revisionist reconstructions of early Islamic history. Some of them are not to be too harsh, but some of them are nonsensical, right? There are, plenty of revisionist ideas that don't stand up. Others, though, remain widely adhered to and accepted and so on, right? These are revisionist reconstructions, not just of Hadith, the origins and development of Hadith, but of early Islamic history. But we're going to focus on those, on the origins and development of Hadith. Now, you might be asking, how can you go about reconstructing what happened if the material is so unreliable? Well, there's several ways we can do it. Some of the material, not Hadith material, but other kinds of material, is pretty reliable, right? The chronology is very reliable, at least as far back as maybe like the first fitna, and then things start to break down a bit. Genealogy seems to be quite reliable. Again, not perfectly reliable. Obviously, there are problems in chronology, there are problems in genealogy, but it seems substantially reliable, right? There have been studies of like marriage patterns, and they're all very coherent, right? So that's like, could this all be the product of some sort of different people fabricating and so on? It's like the fact that it's all very coherent system would suggest that it's just that people are remembering their ancestors and who was who and so on. Also, there's some early inscriptions that we're finding where they have like a chain of names, like so-and-so, son of so-and-so, son of so-and-so. It's like, oh, that guy's recorded in the genealogical sources and so on, right? And so what that means that in a sense, I tend to think that isnads are also reliable, not reliable in the sense that this report actually came through this line. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that I think that isnads largely are tracking actual relationships. Even if all the isnads are fabricated, they were fabricated in a way that made sense to the fabricator. So it makes sense that what they would be appealing to for themselves and for their audiences are known relationships, generally speaking, right? Certainly in the very earliest period where maybe things get a little murkier, which makes sense because people are far more distant from that. So, who actually met the prophet, who didn't meet the prophet, there's a bit more of a question mark with that sort of thing. But generally speaking, I think the genealogy, who was the student of who is the son and the father or the daughter, etc. of who, I think that sort of information is increasingly regarded as basically reliable. We also have prosopography. This is like lists of people, like lists of who were who was involved in this, and who were the first. I mean, well, that material tends to be pretty unreliable. Who was the first who did X, Y, and Z? But like, who were the members of the people of Hadith? Who were the members of the other factions? A lot of that material, people argue, is reliable, right? Again, there are problems, right? So it has to be taken with a grain of salt. But a lot of these lists of people who would, in this sect or that sect, or in this place and that place and so on, this role and that role, a lot of that stuff seems, substantially reliable. So we do have reliable material preserved in the Islamic historical sources. It's just all not Hadith material. But even with Hadith, there are methods we can use to try and sort of figure out, what is authentic or sound or archaic or whatever, right? So we have early non-Muslim literary sources, like early Christian sources, that we can sort of use to sort of triangulate back to a very early period. If a Hadith says something and an early Christian source says something, they both agree, that's got to be a super archaic Islamic belief, right? Has a much stronger claim to reflecting in some way some authentic historical memory. We also have the criterion of dissimilarity, right? Where it's like, if there are things that don't match the later period, you wouldn't make them up later on. So they've got to be archaic, right? And then we also have like comparative anthropology. Like if we find present, like recorded in Hadith, things about Muhammad and his society that match our general background knowledge about the sort of stuff we expect to see in these kinds of conditions, that's a reason to accept it, right? So there are various sort of, criteria that we can use even without accepting Hadith at face value to find sort of authentic material, more archaic material, etc., etc. Okay, so finally, the revisionist models of the origins and development of Hadith. There have been a number of scholars who have sort of reconstructed, sort of an overarching developments of Hadith or whatever, or various aspects of Hadith, specific areas of Hadith, specific genres and so on, or just in general. right? And I've listed a couple of the names of some of the notable people who have been involved in these kind of sketches of the development of Hadith. Plenty of them disagree with each other. Maybe most famously Schacht and Motzki. Well, Schacht was already dead when Motzki's criticized, but Motzki heavily criticized, disagreeing with Schacht. So, of course, there are points of disagreement. But there are also sort of many broad points of agreement, and you can basically synthesize a lot of these scholars together. There are these sort of there is a kind of general picture that emerges. And so what I'm going to give is a kind of synthesis here of what you find in the scholarship. Another thing to remember is that what I'm about to give is an explanation, as in, this is an actual explanation for the state of the corpus, the extant state of the corpus. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, I'm actually going to try and explain why things are what they are. Like, why is it that reports end up being having elements that appear in different combinations in parallel reports? Why is it that reports end up overlapping with other reports that overlap with other reports that overlap with other reports that all end up being totally different, so that just change when you go from one end of the spectrum to the other, and so on and so on. Like, we're going to actually explain this, right? Why is it that all the earliest documents we can actually trace back to the Umayyad period are initially not citing Hadith and so on, and et cetera, et cetera? This is an actual attempt to explain all of that, to actually explain it, not to sort of, sweep it under the carpet. This is an attempt. So this is, keeping that in mind, we're trying to actually explain the evidence here. Right. Okay. So to begin with, the era of the Prophet. The Prophet disseminated teachings, right? Obviously we have the Quran, which has some of these teachings in it. We have some things preserved in the tradition as well. I mean, we have the Sahifat Yathrib, the constitution, or the treaty, or the document often called the Constitution of Medina. And this has authentically, very likely, come from the Prophet, right? So he did, have some teachings. He did disseminate some teachings. But he was very likely unsystematic in this respect. He's a charismatic preacher and a leader of a community, and a military leader who is preaching that the world is about to end, right? It fits very poorly with this, that he was like a rabbi, right? Or like, you see what I'm saying? Like he was like systematically teaching traditions to students, right? In this like vast and programmatic way. It's a very implausible idea, just on the face of it, right? He was viewed as a source of Sunnah. That seems likely. In pre-Islamic Arabia, any authoritative figure could be viewed as a source of Sunnah, right? So probably the Prophet as well. But this was largely nominal, and it was alongside others as well. There would still be all these other sources of Sunnah alongside that. Stories and reports about the Prophet probably were spreading already in his day, right? But there would already be massive distortion, elaboration, etc. occurring, right? This is long before there's a canon, long before systematic written scholarship, and in highly sort of chaotic conditions, right? Of like apocalyptic expectations, and sort of conflicts, and the emergence of new identities, and all this sort of stuff is happening, right? So already things would have been distorted, elaborated, false information would already be proliferating. So what you would have, in other words, spreading is like legends, rumors, gossip, anecdotes, lies, etc., etc. I tend not to think that lying is going on most of the time. I think it's very rare that you find someone who's like lying, like, I am knowingly saying things that are false for self-gain. That's actually very rare. What's mostly happening is motivated reasoning, actually. People are like re-understanding and reimagining things in ways that are convenient for them, and they believe it, right? That's actually a much more common sort of dynamic. So I just want to clarify that. Okay. At the same time, most of the Prophet's followers, right, his Jewish followers, his Christian followers, Arabs from non-Christian and non-Jewish backgrounds, Arab tribes, whatever, most of them just continue to, they've just inherited all of these beliefs and practices that remain unchanged, right? By the way, two general sources that are very helpful for this, not just for the Prophet, but more generally, I would say Bart, Ehrman, Jesus Before the Gospels. Very useful insight into early oral traditions and those kinds of things, storytelling and so on. And also Tanus, The Making of the Medieval Middle East. Very nice insights about how deeply would do like teachings and doctrines and formal teachings and so on penetrate into the general population, right? Very useful insights there. So if you want sort of some sort of general considerations when thinking about what reasonably we would expect to have been happening in this time period, those I would recommend as two very good sources. Anyway, so Jews, Christians, Arabs, etc., have inherited all these different beliefs and practices, and most of those remain in place, right? After the Prophet dies, stories about the Prophet would continue to circulate. So would some of his doctrines. Probably some of the doctrines of the Prophet also are being transmitted. But this transmission is anonymous. It's not yet customary for people to cite sources. So things are being transmitted without people recording in every instance who they got it from. And at the same time, this is an era of extreme mutation, elaboration, and distortion, right? Reports are being radically changed and reshaped and reinterpreted and reconstituted in the course of transmission. Storytellers are also dominant in this kind of context, right? They're dominating communal historical memory, and to some degree they're distorting and creating the communal memory, right? They're the ones who can most effectively tell the stories to appeal to people, appeal to their audiences, tailoring themselves to any given audience, effectively and rhetorically creating stories using their techniques, right, of the sort of common set of elements that they use and reuse in different times and places. And so they are dominating the memory of the life and times of the Prophet, the context of the Quran, sort of in sort of general Arabo-Islamic history. At the same time, caliphs, governors, and individuals who had close links to the caliphs and to the Prophet, although who were all very young when the Prophet died, they become influential in each center. So you start to have authorities or dominant figures emerging in each center, right? Omar is well regarded in most centers. Ibn Mas'ud, for example, becomes prominent in Kufa. He's connected to the government. Ibn Omar in Medina is the son of Omar, right? He becomes influential in Medina. And some of them are probably transmitting some things from the Prophet, but they're also probably altering things from the Prophet in these sort of very sort of mutagenic conditions. They're also adding their own opinions, and they're becoming sources of Sunnah in their own right? Any major figure in the sort of Jahili conception of Sunnah, which is inherited by the early Muslims, any major figure can become a source of Sunnah. So all these post-prophetical figures are becoming sources of Sunnah as well. Additionally, all these Christian and Jewish and Arabian traditions, they just continue to pour in. No, that's the wrong metaphor. They're just being inherited on a mass scale, right? When people convert to Islam, all their old traditions don't vanish. They come in with all their Jewish, their Christian, etc., Zoroastrian, etc. traditions. Some of them might be left at the door if they overtly contradict maybe something that a close authority is directly saying to you. So I'm not saying everything would come in, but you would expect a huge amount of things just to be inherited straight in, right? And now, in the sort of conquest era, there's even a new mechanism for this, not just conversion, but also it's the early Arabs take a colossal number of slaves, right? And so that includes huge amounts of concubines and also just like people who are like servants, right? And so it becomes very common then from this point onwards that people have Christian mothers, Zoroastrian mothers, or else they're being raised around all these servants and slaves who are Christians, Zoroastrians, etc. I mean, this is some scholars have mentioned this, like Gerald Horting actually mentions this, right? But this is I think an often neglected but kind of staggering aspect of early Islamic history in terms of like the transmission of ideas and beliefs and customs. Just imagine the impact of everyone having a Christian mum or a Zoroastrian mum or a Christian mate or a Zoroastrian maid across the whole, all the elites of the society, the early Arab society. The effect must have been colossal in terms of the impact on all the children that are being raised by and around these people, right? So this is another possible or probable vector for mass transmission of other material. Moving into the early to mid Umayyad period, the Sunnah of the Prophet and just Sunnah in general, it remains largely nominal. So most of the time when people are citing Sunnah over and over, it's just a slogan. It just means the right thing to do. It's in the eyes of the beholder, right? So this sort of nominal notion of Sunnah continues to predominate. There's also anonymous oral transmission also is continuing, so people are transmitting material that are probably originated with the Prophet and with caliphs and with other notables and from other religions and from other, in other cultures and so on. Things continue to be transmitted anonymously. And of course, things are being distorted and things are being created as well along the way, right? Regional authorities are continuing to emerge, right? Ibrahim an-Nakha'i in Kufa, Urwa in Medina. And then some continue to transmit and to alter material. Some continue to add their own opinions to things. And around this time, people are beginning to keep sort of written notes, personal notebooks. Things are starting to be written down. And more we have sort of formal master-student relationships, formal study circles are emerging. The custom of citing sources also arises in this time, probably in Kufa, and begins to spread from Kufa. And we have anecdotes illustrating its spread. There's an anecdote about how Qatada, who's operating in this time period in Basra, he's one of the dominant figures in Basra. Initially, he's not citing in sources, right? He's not citing isnads. And then someone comes from Kufa who starts citing sources. And now Qatada also now starts citing sources. This is actually a snapshot into the rise of the institution. You see what I'm saying? We also have, obviously, sectarian identities are crystallizing more and more, right? Discrete sort of Shi'i, Ibadi, and other communities are all sort of are coalescing more and more. Obviously, the more people separate and the more competition is occurring, the more intense all the fabrication and false creation of expedient material would be. In the mid to late Umayyad period, transmission is becoming increasingly formalized. The citation of sources, the citation of isnads becomes widespread at this point, and thereby reports are becoming increasingly reified or formalized. So we're transitioning out of being, gossip, rumors, anecdotes, stories, legends, etc., and they're becoming reports, becoming more and more fixed, if you see what I'm saying. It's sort of these coherent, separate, transmitted blocks of information, if that makes sense. Transmitters, in many cases, probably remember who told them something, but in many cases, they're also not going to remember who told them something, and they certainly would not remember what that person's source was if they even had a source. That information wasn't being systematically recorded up until this point, in retrospect, much later on, where they're now expected to regularly cite sources. And so earlier tradents would have been, in many cases, inferred, guessed, etc., or just otherwise omitted, right? Sometimes early on, people often have incomplete isnads as well. It's fairly common. And also, of course, false ascription is rife at this. People are demanding sources. Obviously, people are going to just be creating false sources as well to conform to that demand. The use of written notes is also increasing, and the rate of alteration in transmission, not uncoincidentally, is decreasing. The more writing increases, the more variation in transmission decreases. And so regional traditions of law and exegesis are now coalescing around local authorities, like, for example, around Hamad ibn Abi Sulaiman in Kufa, and other dominant figures in each region are now, the students of the followers are coalescing around, are forming into major like schools rooted in the teachings of their follower masters, if that makes sense, right? So they're mostly citing the immediate preceding authorities. So Hamad and the people of Kufa are mostly citing Ibrahim an-Nakha'i, for example. Ibrahim an-Nakha'i. There's also a heavy reliance on local custom or consensus, right, which is being conflated with Sunnah. So people are saying, things that we in our region agree upon are correct, right? That's has become sort of a source of Sunnah, or is conflated with Sunnah. Moving into the early Abbasid period, the regional jurists are mostly citing followers and, to a lesser extent, companions, and least of all, the Prophet. They continue to cite local custom and consensus, which is becoming an overriding source of Sunnah, right? So that's precisely how they're actually evaluating reports, is, does this conform with our local consensus? And battles of ascription are occurring within and between the regional traditions, right? The people are creating counter hadiths against each other, right? And in particular, local opposition tendencies against sort of the mainstream school in each region. They tend to try and cite companions and the Prophet to try and trump the major regional schools, which are mostly citing followers. You see, around this time, the first systematic hadith collections are written, for example, by Ibn Jurayj in Makkah, and these are mostly citing hadiths of the followers and hadiths of the companions, with far fewer prophetical hadiths. Also, in this time period, more and more, especially in the sort of competition within and between regions, hadiths are being raised back to the Prophet, and also just, there's been mass false creation is occurring in general of hadiths. Some jurists are probably beginning to cite hadith more than other sources, right? And also, people are starting to travel around and try and find hadith more and more, like Ma'mar and Ibn al-Mubarak. And so this leads to the rise of the people of hadith. They probably start in Basra. It seems like they're most densely associated early on with Basra, right? And they're particularly associated with like Shu'bah, for example. He's the first person. He's not chronologically the first, but he's actually the first person listed by Ibn Qutayba in his list of the Ashab al-Hadith, right? The people of hadith. So it seems like the people of hadith and hadith criticism seem to be linked, right? Because Shu'bah is also the first sort of proper hadith critic. And so they're arising particularly in Basra. This is, I'm going out. This is more my suggestion. I don't know if this is being really argued much in the scholarship. But either way, wherever they're arising, the people of hadith are arising, right? More and more, they're sort of prioritizing hadith. All this hadith is accumulating. All this hadith is now being inherited. It makes sense that there are going to be people who are going to say, well, we have all these hadiths, including all these hadiths from the Prophet. We should just go with the Prophet, right? The Prophet is more important than a companion or a follower. I mean, the Prophet is the one who was inspired by God, so we should actually prioritize prophetical hadiths, right? It's sort of a logical outcome. And so they're justifying doctrine with hadith, not local custom, not reason, etc. And in particular, they're putting prophetical hadith at the top, then companion hadith, and then other kinds of hadith. Now, obviously, in reality, the process is very messy, right? Clearly, people are also inheriting doctrines and then trying to rationalize them. It isn't just this purely rational, like, we are just going to go wherever the evidence leads. If there's a prophetical hadith, we go with that. Actually, it's a more messy process. So one example, which I talked about at a graduate seminar at Oxford during my PhD, I presented on this. I was looking at the way that a Shafi'i was using the marital age hadith, the hadith of Aisha's marital age, which I covered in my PhD. And what's interesting is that he is using it in a really implausible way to try and justify a doctrine, which is actually the Medinan doctrine. And there's a conflicting Kufan doctrine, which is actually supported by a prophetical hadith. So it explains what's going on. If a Shafi'i was being consistent, he should adopt the Kufan position, because that's the one supported by a prophetical hadith. But he's actually inherited the Medinan position from his Medinan master Malik. He's inherited their view on this issue. This is an early debate over forced marriage. He's clearly just inherited their view, and so he wants to justify the view that he's inherited. But within his own system, he ought to actually go with the Kufan view. And so he has to find a prophetical proof text to just rationalize his view, so he latches on to the Aisha hadith. This at least shows that he's not lying, or like inventing hadith, but he is trying to rationalize a position that he's actually just inherited, I think, right? And so that explains why he's citing such an implausible hadith that doesn't really justify his view, because he's clutching at straws. He just has to have at least nominally a prophetic justification against the Kufans, who in his own system have a more justified position. Anyway, so in reality, it's probably a very messy process. And so also, with the rise of the people of hadith, we also have the rise of hadith criticism proper, and this definitely begins with Shu'bah in Basra. Before I jump back in time a little bit to give an overview of hadith criticism, do you have any questions?
Nope, I don't have any.
All right, let's continue. So I'm slightly jumping back in time. There would have been hadith criticism right from the get-go. There would have been hadith criticism in a sense before hadith. As in, when like gossip, rumor, legends, assertions are circulating, people normally don't just accept everything. People will reject some things, right? And the reason why I'm calling this sort of primitive is both because it's what we would expect to be there at the beginning, right? It's also very crude, right? Very ineffective, right? So I'm trying to catch both senses there with the term primitive. This is just what would happen sort of intuitively, organically, right from the get-go, with sort of proto-hadith rumors, stories, gossip, etc., right? Like, if something contradicts someone's opinions or sensibilities, they would reject it. If something doesn't conform with their faction, however that's construed, maybe their region or maybe their sect or whatever, their community, then it's rejected. If it doesn't conform with their faction's doctrine, then it would just be rejected. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, this would just happen intuitively, automatically, organically. This is just what you'd expect to be there at the beginning. It's also what we can trace back earliest. Using our certain source critical methods, Isnad method analysis, we can actually trace back hadiths embodying these approaches to hadith. It's put in the mouth of the prophet, of course. If something is good, then I said it, even if I didn't really say it. But if it's bad, I would never have said that. This is attributed to the prophet. We can actually trace that back to the middle of the 8th century, right? So we can actually, it's the things that we would just sort of expect, sort of conceptually, or just based on sort of general experience, sort of general established background knowledge to be the first things to arise, are also the earliest attested, right? That we can actually securely push back. Then we have secondarily the rise of rationalist hadith criticism, right? And so this is, especially in Iraq in the late 8th century CE, this is where people are starting to say, okay, does it conform to the Quran? Does it conform to consensus? Or is it widely and independently transmitted? And you can see here there's a close link with those regional traditions, right? The regional traditions are evaluating things and prioritizing things in terms of what do we as a whole, our local tradition, what conforms to this, right? And so you can sort of see how an interest in consensus as a whole and widespread transmission can kind of flow out of that. You can sort of see a kind of link there. Then we have Proto-Sunni Hadith criticism, right? And this is arising in the late 8th century CE as well. And so they do inherit some of the more primitive, content kind of criticism, right? Where if something is unorthodox, we reject it. And in fact, in many cases, they're arguing, though not always, there's actually a debate about this. If somebody transmits something objectionable, that is a reason to reject them, right? So you sort of have that sort of, this goes against our doctrine kind of approach still lingering on in Proto-Sunni Hadith criticism. But they also develop this more sort of nuanced and technical system of trying to establish if people are reliable. But this arises at a very late date, and as I already mentioned, it's sort of arising too late, and it's being grandfathered in. Do you see what I'm saying? To all these earlier pre-critical people have sort of been grandfathered into the system, and so they aren't able to actually. None of these approaches are able to actually effectively identify authentic data and filter out inauthentic data. Now, there was something else about that. What's interesting is that arguably Hadith criticism does, Proto-Sunni Hadith criticism, does work from the time that it's being implemented onwards, right? Because the rise of Proto-Sunni Hadith criticism, which also coincides with the generalization of people searching for, going to every region and people systematically writing things down. All of that is around the year 800, approximately, right? And Hadith becomes much more reliable from that point onwards. You can clearly see a massive shift in reliability. Variation becomes minimal. When you look at co-transmissions from sources at that time, it's like the variation is minimal. So this is maybe evidence that Hadith criticism worked from their time onwards, when the scholars were actually in their own time checking what every other scholar had. You see what I'm saying? And checking when you claim you heard something, did the other people hear something? It becomes much more manageable from your own time onwards when it's actually being applied. And another thing that we could add to that is that there are hadiths that were obviously fabricated from the time of the hadith critics onwards that match the events of their time, right? Like referencing the Mihna, the Inquisition, right, of al-Ma'mun, which they don't accept. So they're not accepting fabrications that are expedient for them from their time onwards. The problem, though, is that the things that they have authenticated contain all kinds of obvious fabrications and illusions and references to the whole preceding period. Do you see what I'm saying? Which exemplifies their approach. It seems to be working from their time onwards. It doesn't work in retrospect. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
All right. All right. So finally, we're coming to the end here. Sorry for the going on and on.
Well,
The outcome. Okay. So from the 9th century onwards, Proto-Sunni Hadith critics establish a prophetical corpus, right? And this corpus, as I already mentioned, it's been plucked from different regions, right? So the corpus actually, it comes to us now as like, oh, it's just sort of an objective, universal, it's like decontextualized corpus. It's just, oh, the prophet said all these things. But each one is, this one's from Basra, this one's from Kufa, this one's from Makkah, this one's from Medina, this one's from Syria. It's all been taken out of its context. And if you see what I'm saying, you lose that context if you're just looking at the extant prophetical corpus. Not only that, but you can find hadiths embodying different originally discrete doctrinal tendencies, right? It's sort of a composite doctrinal tradition. It's within certain constraints. They've obviously filtered out anything that's overtly Shi'i, overtly Khariji, etc. But you can still find like Shi'i, sort of kind of like moderate Shi'i, shall we say, or mild Shi'i hadiths. You can find Qadri hadiths. You can find Uthmani hadiths. These different sort of pre-Sunni or proto-Sunni tendencies present. Sort of, we end up with sort of the prophetical corpus by taking it from all these different places. Ends up actually being Sunni corpus. I mean, being a composite doctrinal tradition. The people of hadith end up becoming the Shafi'i and Hanbali legal schools. The Medinian legal tradition becomes the Maliki legal school. The Kufan legal tradition becomes both the Hanafi and the Shi'i legal schools. This is why the Hanafis and the Shia on many legal issues actually agree against the other Sunnis, because they're both outgrowths of the Kufan legal tradition. And then the Basran legal tradition becomes the Ibadi legal school. In the end, hadith is triumphant, right? I already mentioned that some of the early sort of rationalists were rejecting hadith, and there are others as well. There are reports of some early Khawarij who reject hadith, and there are others who are just rejecting all hadith. But in the end, the rise of hadith is inexorable. And you can sort of understand why. It's much easier to justify something with a positive counter-assertion than with nothing. Do you see what I'm saying? It's like having your own reports, your own counter reports is better than just not having a report at all, right? I think there's something more intuitively appealing about that. Having sort of positive or concrete data rather than having no positive or concrete data. Do you see what I'm saying? Or having something more ephemeral. So there's an inherent appeal to hadith as something that you can use to justify or rationalize your position. So in the end, everyone gets on board with hadith, right? So the Mu'tazila come to accept hadith, although they obviously remain much more critical of it, and having much more stringent standards, obviously, very widespread transmission, etc. The people of hadith / the Shafi'is and the Hanbalis, they obviously converge on a specific prophetical canon. The Hanafis and the Malikis, over time, increasingly rationalize their doctrines using hadith, and they come to accept the Shafi'i Hanbali prophetical canon. They all end up forming into the sort of extant classical Sunni consensus, where now the Shafi'is, the Hanbalis, the Hanafis, the Malikis, they're all equally Sunni. They all accept the same Sunni, prophetical canon, which has actually come from the Shafi'is and the Hanbalis / the people of hadith. The various Shi'i sects, they all end up producing their own imamic collections and canons, and even the Ibadis, who in all their early works very strongly embody the more archaic layer where Sunnah is just generic, where the people are mostly citing the opinions of followers, they end up producing a prophetical canon as well. Right, so just to summarize, here I'm going to summarize, because that really was a summary, right? So what I'm going to do here is summarize some of the similarities and differences between the sort of the synthesized kind of revisionist model I just outlined and the traditional models. The differences are the greatest the earlier we go, The later we go, the more the models converge and become more sort of isomorphic, right? So in other words, the earlier we go, the more we disagree. The later we go, the more we agree. The reason for that is obvious. I mean, the sources, the earlier we go, become less and less reliable. The later you go, the more they enter into the era of systematic written transmission, and they're becoming more and more reliable, right? We agree that the use of isnads is secondary, right? But we think it arose later. The second fitna, not the first fitna. We agree that Christian, Jewish, etc. traditions flowed in. Everything I was saying about all these Jewish and Christian and other traditions all being inherited, this is accepted in the traditional narratives. They just think they were able to weed them all out, all the false ones that haven't come from the prophet. But we think, no, actually, they flowed in at a colossal rate successfully. They were successful. They've ended up as Hadiths in the canon. We agree that raising was widespread, right? The Proto-Sunni Hadith scholars in particular talk about raising, and we agree. The difference is we think it happened much more frequently and in cases that they didn't clock or that they're otherwise accepted as being sahih. We agree that every faction created Hadith. We just think it was every faction. You see what I'm saying? So we agree with every faction. Yeah, every other faction was creating Hadith. We agree. But we just think it was every faction. You see what I'm saying? And finally, we agree that some material has survived from the prophet, right? The trouble is that first of all, it wasn't this massive programmatic, systematic transmission. That just seems totally anachronistic and cannot be squared with all this other earlier, stronger, more powerful evidence supported by the criterion of dissimilarity in the earlier sources, or that actually makes sense in terms of constructing a coherent development of the material. The view just doesn't make sense. But there would have been some material likely that's come through that originated with the prophet. The difficulty is that it's hard to detect amidst all of the accretions, the distortions, and the retrojections. We're dealing with sort of an ocean of accretion here. And so what we're trying to do is find in that, where are the authentic kernels from the prophet? All right. That's it. Any questions?
No, but I think you covered all the bases. I don't feel like I needed to ask very much. You covered a lot of ground. I think I'll definitely have some, like, the next time we do a video. Yeah, I feel like this was more of like a introduction to the Hadith.
That's right. It's
and
a
the problems
primer.
with it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining me today, Dr. Joshua Little.
No worries. Thank you for giving me the space and for listening. I'm sorry it went on for so long.
Oh, it's fine.
But yeah, it's a foundation. With this sort of basic information, both the various traditional narratives and also some of the critical scholarship, some of the modern alternative models, it becomes possible then to go into more detail and explore some of them in more, some of the specific interesting debates and issues in more detail, and so on, some of the recent research, et cetera, et cetera. So hopefully that's a useful resource for people.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.